Most of you guys stick around. Most of everybody stuck around through the end of the day. That's great. Part of that could have been our great swag prizes we were giving out. So just say one more time, we've got a few more things to raffle off today. Got another one of these awesome buck knives with the esplanade on the blade. Thank you to Bayer for donating some of that stuff. We've got a Rajuvra hat that'll go as a package at the break. And then we've got another Bayer Range and Pasture hat and this awesome Yeti mug that we'll raffle off at the end. So stick around, you might be able to win one of those cool prizes. We thought that we'd kick off today by just a recap of what we covered yesterday and then sort of giving you an overview of what you can expect to hear about today. And we thought a cool way to recap yesterday would be to look at the awesome graphic recording that Carrie Frickman was working on in the background all day yesterday. So we will be sharing this with everybody at the conclusion of the workshop, but thought that it would be cool to sort of run through it at the beginning of the day today and just refresh everyone's memory about what we covered yesterday. So yesterday we kicked off the workshop with a talk from Mark Owens and Chad Boyd titled The Big Uneasy. We really wanted to give everybody an honest sense of the complexities and difficulties around managing invasive annual grasses, including the economic impacts that those have on our communities. And then we moved on to hear a little bit about the intro to the SageCon Invasives initiative from Megan Kreutzberg, where she talked about some of the barriers that had been identified to invasive annual grass management and an introduction to the geographic strategy. And we sort of used the geographic strategy to shape the agenda for this workshop as a whole. The idea of defend the core, grow the core, and then mitigate impacts. And so that took us to our.
Ben, you're muted.
Have I been muted this whole time?
No, just muted for a second.
Okay, not sure how that happened. Thanks for pointing that out, Brad. So that took us from Megan's talk about the geographic strategy to the first panel discussion we had with Matt Cahill, Jeremy Maestas, and Mark Porter about defending the core and how do we keep the good, how do we stop the spread of invasive annuals. And Matt summed it up really well, I think, about how do we make this lifestyle change and sort of incorporate invasive annual grass management into every management action that we have on the landscape. And so after hearing from them about defending the core, we moved on to talk a little bit about breaking the fire cycle. And we imagine this as defending the core as well, because without having some control over fire on the landscape, we're likely not going to have very much control over invasive annual grasses either. And so in this panel, talking about managing wildfires and some tactics that we can do to reduce wildfires, things like fuel breaks, some emerging technologies out there for early detection, improving response time to fires, some discussion around rural fire protection agency relationships, and then a little fire lesson on fire behavior triangle and focusing on what we can control, which is fuels and fuels management. And so that led us to our next panel discussion, which was focused on wildfire risk, where we sort of focused on utilizing grazing as a tool for reducing the risk of wildfires. We talked a lot about some of the benefits that come along with utilizing grazing as a tool, but also acknowledging the limitations of grazing in terms of the BLM permitting and the impacts that grazing can have on the landscape. And then, understanding that while there are some actions that we can take to reduce wildfire risk on the landscape, we're never going to stop them all, and that fire is going to burn eventually. And when that happens, the condition of the landscape really matters. And so that took us to this panel discussion on ratcheting up resiliency. And sort of some abiotic factors, some biotic factors, and things that we must consider when we're talking about resiliency, and also some things that we can do to enhance recovery of areas, both pre and post fire. And then we sort of wrapped up the first day, and that takes us to today, where we're going to focus more on growing the core and what we can do to reclaim at-risk or already converted lands. We'll have a panel discussion about managing invasive annual grasses annually, because that one's going to sort of focus on emerging herbicide treatments and the idea that, you know, it's not a one and done treatment when we're talking about invasive annual grass management. We have got a panel discussion focused on promoting perennials, some new technologies, considerations, and efforts underway to make sure that when we do seed, that's successful. That will be followed up by a panel discussion on prioritization and how do we choose where we work. We sort of learned yesterday with the geographic strategy that where we work matters, and what we do where we work matters. So how do we prioritize where we work and what we do in those areas? And then sustaining long-term investment is another thing that comes up a lot. And that was one of the barriers I identified yesterday. How do we sustain this year after year investment in invasive annual grass management? And then we'll wrap it all up with essentially the same panel that we had yesterday to the intro: Matt Cahill, Jeremy Maestas, Mark Porter, and then Jeff Rose, BLM District Manager, to pull it all together and come away with some next steps, what we can do after what we've learned from today's and yesterday's workshop to put this to use in the work that you're all doing. So that's my wrap up. With that, I'll kick it off to Brad Adig to get us going today.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back today. Yesterday was a great day. If you did miss it, I know that they mentioned that it is going to be available so you can watch it over and over and over again. Just a few small housekeeping items. One, please mute your microphones. Keep background noise at its minimum if you're not speaking. If you're on a phone, you may have to hit *6 to mute. Camera, if you are not a panelist or a presenter, we're going to ask that you please turn your camera off. If anyone has noticed that they need to rename themselves, you can go to the participant list, find your name, click on 3 little dots, and then you can click on rename just in case you have gotten yourself renamed somehow. Views in the upper right-hand corner, there is a small box that you can change the view to enlarge upon the speaker or change to a gallery view. Chat, if you have any technical questions, please chat. Go to the chat box, which you can access usually down at the bottom, but sometimes it might be at the top. Move your mouse and go do a direct chat to Jenna Stillman. She will help you with any technical problems. And one last shout out to Carrie Frickman with heartwoodvisuals.com. That is absolutely awesome. And I've seen a ton of great comments coming through on chat on that amazing thing. And I did see someone talking about tattoos. So who knows? There could be a lot of invasive species tattoos running around. I want to introduce our first moderator, Anya Tyson. Anya works to improve collaborative conservation outcomes across the sagebrush steppe at the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. Previously, she worked as a science communicator at the helm of volunteer-driven research efforts spanning the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies. And a little known fact about Anya, she was the co-star of a mule deer migratory documentary. Welcome, Anya.
Thank you, Brad. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure this morning to moderate to all 213 of you that I see have joined, and perhaps a couple more trickling in. And first up, we're going to talk about managing annual grasses annually. And I think My presenters that you're going to hear from in a moment will be able to speak to far better than me about how this is an effort that is sustained over multiple years and looks different potentially every year. And so we're going to hear from folks, some really knowledgeable folks. We're going to hear 5 rapid fire quick presentations, and feel free to fire questions into the chat. And we hope to have around 20 minutes at the end of the presentations to field everybody's questions. So stay engaged in the chat, pop your questions in there, and we'll get to them in time. And without further ado, I'd love to ask Harry Quick to share his screen and give us a little presentation. And Harry, here you are, your screen sharing, and we have yet to hear from you. So just checking out your audio.
Okay, yep, this is Harry Quick. Can you hear me?
Yes, sounds great.
Okay, I'm Western Stewardship and Development Manager for Bayer. I've been working on Rajuvra for the last 6 years. So very happy to give you a short presentation. As Anya said, a rapid fire presentation on this. So I'm going to move pretty quickly. So Rajuvra is a new herbicide for restoration of Western rangeland and natural areas. The key attribute here is that it provides up to 4 years control of invasive annual grasses. So all the major grasses, cheatgrass, Medusa head and ventilator, and others. And then at the same time as controlling those invasive annual grasses, it's releasing perennial grasses, forbs, and shrubs. You can see untreated on the left and Rajuvra treated on the right. I'm going to show just a few pictures from around the country. This is ventilator control in Washington. You can see the ventilator untreated areas in the top left and right, and the perennial grass release in the middle. This is an example of Medusa head control in Utah. You can see the Medusa head on the left totally suppressing those perennial grasses and released after the Rajuvra treatment. Cheatgrass control in Wyoming, same thing with those perennial grasses released after the treatment. And this is an example from Colorado. This is feral rye control. And, before that treatment, we thought we might have to reseed that area. There was no reseeding done. In fact, there's no reseeding done in any of the pictures I'm showing today. All those plants came back. They were just waiting to be released from that invasive annual grass competition. This is an example of ventilator control in Wyoming. And this is another shot of cheatgrass control, this one in Colorado. You can see the red color on the cheatgrass on the left and the green of the perennials in the Rajuvra treated area on the right. So all of this leads to increased forage production. This is an example of forage production 2 years after the treatment. 533 pounds per acre untreated, 1,830 pounds per acre and treated. That all has a major impact on return on investment for a rancher. In fact, when you put the numbers to this example and take the treatment cost into consideration, the return on investment is 23% in this case, the ROI. And then, we've also documented that a whole range of different native plants are released when you get rid of these invasive annual grasses. So warm season grasses, the cool season grasses, perennial forbs. We also have annual forbs coming back into these plots, and shrubs are released. We see the leader growth increasing, which is really good for elk and deer habitat. And then fire is a big part of this. In Colorado, you may have heard on the news some pretty big fires this summer. In fact, they've just put them out quite recently. This was an area previously treated with Rajuvra. You can see the demarcated area there, and untreated area. You can see how as soon as we had that annual grass removed with Rajuvra, we had a spotty, much cooler burn. And think about the impacts of that long-term wind erosion, water erosion, or runoff. Huge impact of the Rajuvra treatment. So this is all documented in trials throughout the West. And we have over 130 replicated field trials. 18 university departments have worked on this, 22 faculty and graduate students, 12 agency, local government and NGO cooperators, and we have 9 publications in peer-reviewed journals. So that's my very quick overview of Rajuvra. Certainly appreciate the opportunity. Additional information at rajuvra.com. And I must mention Kent Pittard, the sales manager for Pacific Northwest, including Oregon. You can find his name amongst the participants today. And so you can also contact him on email. Thanks, Anya.
Thank you. Those are some powerful visuals you shared, Harry. Thank you so much. And you really did a great job sticking to time. There's been a bunch of great questions for you in chat. Some of those you can tackle in the chat. Some we'll save for our panel discussion. But at this point, I'd love for Debbie Wood to present some case studies very close to home here in Oregon for us.
Yeah,
Debbie, yes, there you are.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, good, thanks. Thanks for having me today. Let me try and share the screen here.
All right, we're seeing your screen.
Okay.
And now we are seeing presenter view now, so we can see like notes in the next slide coming up.
Can you
there
see,
we go.
You see it all right?
Now it's looking great.
Okay, good. Thanks for having me today. My name is Debbie Wood. I'm with Crooked River Weed Management Area. We're here in Prineville, Oregon. We are one of, I think there's 26 weed management areas in Oregon. So I'm glad to be presented here. I'll be talking about a project that we did in, it was between Post and Paulina, pretty much the center of Oregon. And we were looking for 5 years. We had a grant tagged on to the sage grouse and improving habitat. Our project, if you can see here, you know, we were from Post, to give you an idea, from Post to clear over to, this is Supplee area. You know, there's probably a good, I don't know, 50 miles, 70 miles, somewhere in there. So we were looking at restoring lands invaded with Medusa head. We were focusing on Medusa head, and these are all on private lands. We're looking at the sage grouse habitat in those areas too. So this was a 5-year project with Medusa head. The first year, if you can see down below, these are the total acres treated, acres surveyed. The first year in 2015, looking at the herbicide treatment, we used 7 ounces of panoramic, 16 ounces of MSO. When doing that, you know, in the springtime, going back, we looked at some of the perennials were damaged. Some of them were yellow in some areas. So this was all aerial sprayed too. And maybe there's some wind drift. And so some of the areas maybe got hit twice. So we noticed there was some perennial damaging. So then the following year we came back, did 6 ounces panoramic, and we switched to Hazen. That treatment was, we saw that it was a little less effective. Maybe the surfactant was a little heavy. It didn't go into the soils like we wanted. The following year we looked at 6.5 ounces of plateau, and we switched to grounded. A different surfactant, and that made the difference. We noticed a good kill the next spring, and so we stayed with that. the next couple years in 2018 and 2019, that was our choice of treatment. So when you're looking at a Mazapic treatment with the surfactant, it comes out to be $11.88 an acre. And then you're looking at fall treatments every year. With the herbicide, Mazapic, it's fall treatments, and then it stays all through the winter. And these areas were, I'll go to the next one. So these areas were ones where, we've had a little bit of Medusa head here and there, in sage-grouse habitat. This is a pre-treatment in 15, and then post-treatment picture below. And you'll see in between the perennials, you'll see the kill there. And with these treatments, it's good to go for 2 years, possibly 3 years, in areas where maybe there's the aerial treatments where there's junipers. A lot of times you'll get shadowing and come back and do like a third treatment. This was an area that was a juniper cut and sage-grouse habitat. I think there was a couple leks in this area. So in 2015, we did treatment, and then here's a picture of the post-treatment. This was about 800 acres. Then we came back a second year. It still was in there. There was pockets of Medusa head, and there's Vetinata that came into. So in 2017, came back in, did some treatments, and then the 2018 picture, that would be the second run of herbicide. Let's see, let me go back here a little bit. So herbicide is an effective treatment. It's just, you got to think of it as doing it annually. Perennials will come in, and it's kind of an ongoing with herbicide, I think. Sometimes with the landowners, the cost is a factor, and this is cost effective for them to, Mazapic is. And that is it on herbicide. Looking at the Pseudomonas bacteria. So in 2016, we ended up getting a Western SAR grant to look at the bacteria that was available at the time as inoculant. It was the MB906 bacteria strain. Now there's about 3 strains. This was one of them. The bacteria, it was $8.40 an acre. We did in the fall treatment with herbicide and without herbicide. If you're looking at the bacteria, they say that you don't need to treat, it's every 4 years. So treat every 4 years, it stays in the soils. Down here, we aerial sprayed 2,862 net acres. We did have some landowners that ATV sprayed some acres, and it's 1 gallon per acre. And then with the herbicide, we use 6 ounces per acre in Mazapic. And if you wanted more information, this is where it is. It was with the project, you can see it online. So it was in the same area, looking at different landowners that wanted to participate. I think we had probably, 8 landowners, I believe, that participated in this, which trying to get landowners to not do anything with the area for at least 4 years or so was a little bit difficult. I think landowners like to see instant results and then move on. So these are just some pictures of our areas that we looked at the bacteria. This area is one that was around a pivot, so it's more loamy soils. In 2016, this is before it was sprayed, and then 2018, this is what it looked like. So next slide. This was bacteria only treatment in 2016. And this is a rocky clay red soils area. So in 16, when it was treated, it looked like this. 17 in the spring, when things are growing, it's coming back, and then in 18, that's what it looked like. And then we ended up treating it in 19 with Imazapic. There, you can see it's still there. This is another area at TNC, Juniper Hills Preserve. It was bacteria only. Wanted to put it on the preserve because there's no grazing there, and so that wasn't a factor. You can see in 2016, there's pockets of Medusa head and cheatgrass through there. 17 in the springtime, you can see the pockets, and then in 18 in the spring, there's pockets through there too. This was
Debbie, this is great.
Yeah.
Just asking you to wrap up quickly here. So I'm
Okay.
appreciating the pictures you've shown us, but
Okay.
you're reaching the end of the time limit.
Okay, no. So this is another site. This was kind of a pasture area, so soil's a little bit different. And this was bacteria only. You can see what it looks like 16, 17, and 18. And this was another area. I just threw this in because this was a rocky area, and over here we had strips, and I don't know, there was something happening, but I don't know. And here's another area. This is with cheatgrass in a field, and then here's another area. And that is it.
Thank you, Debbie. I have some follow-up questions for you, so I'm gonna ask them for you in our panel. But for now, we're gonna roll on along and hear from Carter Crouch. Thank you again, Debbie.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Carter Crouch, and I'm the Wildlife Program Manager for the Burns Paiute Tribe here in Burns, Oregon. The tribe owns and manages 2 wildlife mitigation properties, and one of these properties is located approximately 10 miles east of Ventura, Oregon. And as you can imagine, we have quite a bit of a problem with cheatgrass and Medusa head. Over the years, the tribe has tried many methods to control these invasive annuals with various levels of success, but no surprise, we still have quite a bit of a problem with cheatgrass and Medusa head. In 2018, we secured a conservation innovation grant from NRCS to conduct some Medusa head treatment trials. And Kirk Davies found that a combination of prescribed fire, Imazapic application, and range seed drilling was the most successful approach to Medusa head management. In short, the fire removes the thatch and kills some of the seed bank, and then primarily allows the herbicide to get down to the soil where it's needed to go to work. But Kirk's work was done at a small experimental scale, 5 by 5 meter plots. So the purpose of our project was to test his methodology at management scale. And in our instance, it was looking at 5 to 15 acre plots, which is probably still small compared to some of the 1,000 acre patches that we see, but we do think that it's a reasonable size to try to tackle at a management scale. In addition to comparing that treatment combination of fire, pre-emergent herbicide, and range seed drilling, we also wanted to compare Imazepec and Indaziflam in side-by-side treatments. In our case, we were using Esplanade 200 SC, which is similar to Rajuvra that Harry was just talking about. So we conducted this prescribed fire and herbicide application this October, so I don't have any results to report just yet. Hopefully more to come on that in the next couple of years. We do have a couple of years of pre-treatment data. We'll be collecting post-treatment data in the next 3 years, and we'll be doing the range seed drilling next fall. But I do have a few thoughts and lessons that we've learned for the project. We intentionally picked spots that didn't have much sagebrush at all. We didn't want to burn up sagebrush because we know that it's expensive to restore and can take decades. So we were definitely treating areas that were not part of the core that we talked about yesterday. These we picked areas that we thought were about as bad as they could get, and if the treatments didn't work, we wouldn't be in a worse situation. But with that said, we did lose sagebrush. We lost sagebrush putting in burn lines. We lost a few sagebrush in the burn units, and we lost sagebrush where the fire got outside the lines. So that's something that we'll be working on the next few years to recover. And fire, in our case, was very difficult and very expensive to get on the ground. Like I said, we wanted to pick areas that didn't have a lot of sagebrush, and in our case, these areas were fairly inaccessible. We had to get there with UTVs or ATVs. And I imagine quite a few land managers listening to this session today have a lot of acres that are similar. It's just really hard to get to. And due to the inaccessibility and the steep topography, the fire was expensive and it was hard to complete. We also used UTVs and ATVs with boom sprayers to spray the herbicide, and an even ground application was pretty difficult in our complex topography. It's hard to go 3 miles an hour when you're going up and over hills. But I think we did a pretty good job. And herbicide dye is not very useful on recently blackened ground. So that was something that I didn't really take into account until we started getting the herbicide on the ground. But from what I've seen so far, I do not know if the treatments are going to work very well, but I will be able to report on that in a few years. But if I was going forward, knowing what I know now, I think I would approach these treatments differently in the future. I would probably likely avoid fire on our property unless the conditions were a lot different than ours. I've seen areas that have basically no shrub component. It's just a Medusa head flat, and these are areas that have previously burned. If you have an area like that you can get fire engines into easily and get in solid burn lines, I don't see why this methodology wouldn't be the way to go. Also, if you're like the BLM and you have your own fire crews and you don't have to contract it out, I think that would save a lot on the cost. And I would probably also contract our herbicide applications out to helicopter or drone pilots. We didn't in this case because we had project partners that could do it with us for cheap. And I was a little bit worried about herbicide drift since we were doing 2 herbicide applications side by side and we're trying to compare these two. And with that, since I don't have any results, I think I'm gonna stop talking, let people that do report on their results, but happy to answer any questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Carter. I appreciate that. That was succinct and had a lot of useful information. Now we're going to hear from Bill Drott from the Burns BLM district. We heard from him yesterday. And today he's going to be focused a little bit more on not grazing, but other methods of controlling invasive annual grasses. Take it away, Bill.
Thank you.
We can hear you and we can see your screen, but it's not yet in presentation mode.
Oh, that's right.
Now, oh yeah, there you go. You've
Okay.
got the hang of this.
Oh, you bet. So this is a brief history of the use of plateau on the Burns BLM. And the key point here is in sometime between 1984 and 1987, there was an injunction placed against herbicide use on all BLM lands in Oregon. And the result of this injunction was that we could only use 4 different active ingredients, 3 of which were sort of selective against broadleaf plants, and one of them was glyphosate that just kills everything. So not a very good solution to intermix Medusa head and perennial bunch grasses. So there's a certain amount of NEPA activity, and in 2010, the injunction was modified to allow us to use all the BLM approved herbicides on both noxious weeds and invasive annual grasses. And the importance of that is in Oregon, cheatgrass is not a noxious weed. Medusa head is. So starting in 2012, we began a pretty active program of treating Medusa head with plateau. However, there were years of buildup, so we are way behind the 8 ball. And I showed this picture yesterday. We have thousands of acres that look like this. What this map shows, the importance of this map is all these little gray areas are susceptible to Medusa head invasion based on soil and climate qualities of these areas. And in Harney County, this is 1,200,000 acres out of about 5 million acres. So we are very susceptible to Medusa head invasion. Oh yeah, and the rest of this presentation is essentially a commercial for Rajuvra. So I want a big check from Harry. So we have, since 2012, sprayed at least 30,000 acres a year with aerial treatments of Medusa, or aerial treatments of plateau, using both airplanes and helicopters. And a lot of it has been very successful. Unfortunately, we've had issues. This is the Buzzard Fire, which burned in 2014. We did the treatment in the fall of 2015. And in the spring of 2016, it looked like this. The result of an extensive investigation was the herbicide company gave us enough herbicide to retreat this whole area. Nobody could figure out what was causing this striping, and the obvious thought is it related to some way, you would be able to detect some sort of airplane connection to this pattern, but we couldn't. A lot of people will bring up the idea that if you can't treat a whole area, it's not worth it. I can certainly see the rationale for that, but sometimes we just do not have that opportunity or luxury. Here's a picture of a Medusa head treatment. The lower part is treated and the upper part is different ownership and is untreated. Fortunately, on the Buzzard Fire, or post-Buzzard Fire, we have been pretty much in sync, although not year by year, but like a couple of years by a couple of years, with NRCS and SWCD programs in Harney County to treat areas in the buzzard fire that have a lot of Medusa heads. So although it's not perfect coordination, it is fairly coordinated. So this might be my last picture. This question came up yesterday, and so this is a picture of a fuel break. And you can see this edge here, you can see this edge here, you can see this here is a rabbit brush, but this out here is largely cheatgrass. So this is a road through the middle of the Miller Homestead Fire, which burned in 2012. We treated it in 2015. This is 2016 photo. And you can, the impact to the cheatgrass is obvious on the photo. And the answer to the question yesterday, when would you build fuel breaks? The best opportunity we at BLM have is immediately following a fire. So it's good for the next fire. It isn't good for the last fire, but we have money for fire rehab and we can use it for this sort of treatment. Okay, that's my brief presentation of the history of birds BLM using plateau.
Thank you, Bill. I imagine you're going to get some questions in the chat and also in our discussion section. But before we get to discussion, we're going to hear from Lynn Silva of the Vail BLM district. So Lynn, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in.
So can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, I'll dive right into this. I'm Lynn Silva. Good morning. I've worked for the Vail District for about 30 years, 26 of those as the invasive species coordinator for the Malheur Field Office. Since about 2014, we have treated almost 220,000 acres of rangeland using plateau, and I will say the product name plateau simply because that is what we have used. Most of our treatments have been ESR, a little bit of fuels. Briefly, I want to talk about two different projects. They were both ESR. We used the same treatment, but for different reasons. So the Saddle Draw fire was the other side of Bill's buzzard fire, and thank you, Bill, for introducing our problems with NEPA and everything, and finally being able to use good products to treat invasive annual grasses. So the Saddle Draw fire portion of buzzard was about 250,000 acres. About 138,000 of that was Vail BLM. And an ID team identified about 100,000 acres of that that would benefit from plateau for invasive annual grasses. We got funded for about 20,000. We were able in 2014, late fall, to get 1,000 acres out, which was by design because we wanted to know before we did the 20,000 what it was going to do. So we went back out in the spring of 2015 and it was good. The good stuff was there, the bad stuff was gone. So by mid-October, we had finished our 20,000 acres. We went back out as an ID team, which is generally the botanist, myself, and a wildlife biologist. And we were going to identify areas that we thought were going to need drill seeding. And we went across these 20,000 acres and really didn't find anything that we thought would benefit by seeding because we would do more damage than good. Now, in hindsight, there was about maybe 600 acres of one area that we should have drill seeded because it had too much of a presence of Medusa head, and that came back in pretty strongly. So on this project, I was able to monitor it for about 4 years. For the first 2 years, we had excellent results. I actually could not tell a difference between year 1 and year 2 treatments. They both maintained very well. By the 3rd year, the Medusa head was coming back in the areas that had Medusa head. And by the 4th year, they were back and dominant. But overall, the perennial grasses did great and the forbs did great, and we were very pleased. This ended up being a protecting the core, or we referred to it as a rescue treatment. And so my next project is a bit different. It definitely was not rescuing or protecting, it was to get perennials back. And this is an area called Graveyard Point. It's lower elevation. It's been used very hard and predominantly invasive. It's right next to the green belt, about 4 miles from Homedale, Idaho. So we had tried previously around 2000, 2002, some restoration projects and tried to get some crested wheat in there. And every year the annual grass would overrun it and we'd have failures. Then in middle August 2015, the soda fire blew up north of Jordan Valley, about 10 miles, ran about 20 miles or 30 miles north, swapped over into Oregon, and burned about 46,000 acres of Vale BLM. And we knew that this area had about 4 different places that we wanted to do some drill seeding. So we were able to get all of our NEPA done and get the drill seeding areas seeded that, that same fall. And luckily, we got the same contractor that was working on Saddle Draw. And so they just moved from Saddle Draw and got those drill seeding areas completed. In, I'm losing my place here.
You're doing great.
Yeah. So anyway, I went back out in 2016 to evaluate it, and I had a really good seed bed. The invasives were gone. And so late that fall, we drill seeded with crested wheat. Again, this is low elevation. We knew that the perennials that had been there 100 years ago were not going to work well. And we got it drill seeded. I went back out in the following spring, and I was impressed. We had some aim plots there, and they weren't as positive as I was, but I knew that nothing had been there. And so whatever came was a lot better than what we had before. The previous winter and that spring had been really wet, which makes you look real good. And so we had a strong crested wheat seeding. The problem was about April, along came Russian thistle. And we thought that it would take out the crested wheat, but the crested wheat had gotten strong enough, had a good enough root system that it worked very well and managed to make it to the next year. So it was 2018, I went back out. This was the second year for the seeding, and the change was extremely dramatic. The rows had filled in, the crested wheat had tillered and had a really strong base. Again, that year, the Russian thistle came back, but the crested wheat threw it off. 2019 was a very dry, miserable spring. The crested wheat didn't get very high, but it continued to fill in. And so we now, where we had nothing before, have a pretty strong seeding in the Graveyard Point area. So that was getting the perennials back. Some of the things that we've learned over the years. Nothing's going to be perfect. You know, do your best, look over the fence, see what your neighbors are doing. If they're doing better than you, ask questions. But overall, we've been very happy with what Plateau has done for us. We haven't had the dense areas of Medusa head that Bill has treated. We do have a little streaking, but a lot of that has been cosmetic. If you get on the ground, you realize that it's really hard on POA if you get a little bit higher than the 6-ounce rate. And the POA is there, but the streaking is because it doesn't seed. And so when you get in and walk across it, there really hasn't been that much damage done. And so I don't know how I am for time.
You're getting close to the end, but you're doing great. If you want to share one last thought, I'd love to hear it.
That's pretty much what I have to say. We're very happy with what we're seeing. We've been doing, I'll say one thing, the rescue treatment, I think, is by far the best bang for your buck. And that is, you know, now it's called protecting the core. And I think that's the best way to do it. But there are some areas you just need to go in and bite the bullet and try to get something besides the invasives in there. And the importance at Graveyard Point is it's part of that wildland urban interface area. And there's a big concern with wildfires burning. I know that soda scared the devil out of the Homedale farming community because it burned right up to the edge.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, thank you so much. Folks, it's kind of ridiculous that I had those presenters move through their work in 5 to 10 minutes because it was a lot of work that we just heard about. So many innovations and years of effort and trying new things. And we've had some really great questions in the chat, and we have about 15 minutes for discussion. And so I'm going to go through and ask a question to each of our presenters who presented first. So first to last. So starting with Harry. Harry, you have been really tackling a ton of questions in the chat. Folks are really curious about Rajuvra. And what I'd like to ask you is there something that you answered in the chat that, or that you couldn't answer in the chat alternatively because the answer would have been complex? And so I'm asking you to speak to, is there any sort of complexity or nuance around the use of Rajuvra, or a specific question that somebody asked you in the chat that you'd like to share now with the full group verbally?
Yeah, I think there's a general question about, you know, which addresses the understanding of how Rajuvra works. And I really didn't address that. So it's a pre-emergence herbicide, so it controls seed as they try to germinate. And what it does is it stops the root from developing. And so that's why it's highly selective in controlling annual species. You know, the perennials have their roots way below the surface. The Rajuvra is tightly bound to soil and it has low water solubility. So it stays very close to the soil surface. So when the perennial roots are below the surface, they're not impacted. And there's essentially no foliar activity. So there's no uptake and impacts on plants through foliar uptake. It's all through germinating seed. And, you know, because of this impact we have on seed germination, also the fact that a single application controls the annual grasses for up to 4 years, we can really start to get an effect on the annual grass seed bank. Because, you know, once you get to 4 years, you might have totally, you know, significantly reduced that annual grass seed bank. So I think that was kind of a point that really needed some clarification. And, you know, all the pictures I showed were from a single application. And I'll just throw in here as well, it's a different mode of action. It's a cellulose biosynthesis inhibitor. And so, you know, we do have a resistance issue, herbicide resistance. And, you know, there is documented resistance to ALS herbicides to annual grasses, such as, you know, Plateau, which is an ALS herbicide. So we have to be very careful about annual applications of any herbicide because that's the fastest way to speed up the evolution of resistance. So I think just throw out those few points.
Appreciate that, Harry. And I hope cellulose biosynthesis makes it into the graphical drawing somehow, because it's a mouthful and a fun one. I'm going to now direct a question to Debbie. And Debbie, yeah, you really showed us so much effort in all of those photos. And I would love it if you could kind of, you showed us an array of projects and an array of methodologies. And if you had to distill that multitude of experience down to a couple take-home messages of like what you might advise a colleague in a similar geography or what you might do next year, what might that one or two take-home messages be? And also folks are definitely interested in the fact that you presented on use of Pseudomonas, the bacteria. And so if you have any thoughts on that, I think the audience would be keen to hear it.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of information in a short period of time. I think that, you know, we work with landowners, and the idea is a lot of times they want quick results. You can't get quick results with invasive annuals. It takes time, and getting that perspective, it's a mindset, and getting them to understand that it takes time, and, you know, pick areas that you know that you can handle. Don't pick large areas. We found a lot of landowners didn't know what, everybody knows what cheatgrass is. A lot of landowners didn't know what Medusa head looked like. Once we went in and educated them a little bit on what to look for, they realized, oh, I've got it everywhere. And they were all in. A lot of times it's all in. Let's tackle it. But the land there's just too much. So pick your areas, pick your battles. What you can, you know, maybe those vector areas, start there first. I guess that's my take home on it. It's ongoing. It's not a one year and it's solved. It's got to be a mindset of every year. And as for the bacteria, that project, there's a lot of information. I put it. It's on I put the website. It has a lot more information on there. It was a Western SAR project. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot to that. You can look at that. But one of the questions was, you know, the bacteria. There's more research needs to be done on it. You know, we need more tools in the toolbox. So maybe that's one, maybe it's not. We just need more research.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing so candidly about your experiences with it, right? Because sometimes helpful scientific articles, that's a really helpful information source. Sometimes it's really helpful to hear direct from folks. So thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, thank you.
We have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to take a page out of Jack Southworth's book and ask our other three panelists for their final thoughts. So first, Carter, I'd love for you to share your final thoughts. You could address a question in the chat or just reflect on what you heard other presenters say. And yeah, we're looking for your words of wisdom at this time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I probably don't have too many words of wisdom, but I guess looking at the chat and some of the things we talked about yesterday and today, there are no easy solutions. A lot of people are asking about herbicide and its effects on the native plant community, and that's something I think about a lot. But I also know that Medusa head and cheatgrass have negative effects in the plant community. So doing nothing has its own risks, and doing something also has risks. Seeding non-native perennial bunch grasses is also something that I struggle a lot with, and I see a lot of comments in the chat about that. But at least from my perspective, I'm managing about 6,000 acres to do a large-scale treatment. I've got to find money to do it, and I could be spending $100,000 on a treatment. And if nothing establishes after that treatment, then I just spent $100,000 to accomplish nothing, just delay it a few years. So I do think that herbicide has a place, and I think non-native perennials also probably have a place, at least in the low elevation sites. And I don't really like it, but that's the world we live in until we find a better alternative. When I plan a project, I usually include non-native bunch grasses and perennial native bunch grasses, and try to include a mix. And yeah, I probably lose a little bit of sleep over it at night because I came from Texas where the perennial bunch grasses were the problem, and they were typically planted for similar reasons that we plant crested here. So I wish I had better answers. Definitely have a lot of conflicting thoughts about it, but doing nothing's also not a great option, unfortunately.
Thank you, Carter. I appreciate you speaking to some of the challenges really directly. And we're still going to hear from Bill and Lynn, but that's a pretty good segue to our next session, is that we're going to be talking about what are those ways that we're working on and solving issues to have more options in terms of native species, cultivars, in terms of getting perennials back. So a little bit of foreshadowing there, but Bill, I'd love to hear your final thoughts. And Lynn, you're on deck for final thoughts.
I think I would like to sort of fall back to several points that were made yesterday. This is not the only treatment. It will be appropriate in some places, it will be inappropriate in other places. There are other actions that need to occur in conjunction with or after herbicide treatments. If we use herbicides for field breaks, for example, if we use herbicides for field breaks in Medusa head, we probably need to seed the field break, because if Medusa head was a problem when you started and you spray it and you stand there and stare at it, sooner or later it will be back. So this is all part of a bigger program of annual grass management. And one of the things that I especially liked from yesterday is you have to know the condition of your site, both climatically, the soils, and the history of the plant community to make an effective selection of a treatment method. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Lynn, we have about 1 minute left. So if there's anything you'd like to add, we're game to hear it.
Well, the interesting thing, we talk about selecting our sites. With us, where we're driven mostly by fuels and ESR, the sites select us. And so we try to do the best that we can. I move in lockstep practically with the botanist. So we're very concerned about not taking out perennials, natives. And wow, it's hard to say something in 1 minute. It's a huge subject, but just do your best. Sometimes not doing anything is the worst thing you can do. And my idea is first, do no harm. And so we have gone out there, we have looked, we have evaluated, we try to know what is going to be the effect. And Plateau so far has been really good on native perennials, and the forbs are great. So we did that evaluation before we ever went in and did the big blocks.
Thanks, Lynn. You did a smashing job of fitting some wisdom into a minute. And yeah, it's a complex scenario that I'm hearing from folks. Sometimes you have license to walk away. Other times that's the worst thing you can do. Sometimes you need to make really difficult choices to battle with this. Perhaps that's the norm, that you need to make difficult choices to grapple with this wicked problem of invasive annual grasses. But, you know, Today, we're also going to focus on some solutions, some innovations, looking down the road, what work is being done right now to give us additional tools in the toolbox, to use a phrase that's been referenced quite a bit. And so a big thank you to all of our presenters on the last panel, Managing Invasive Annual Grasses Annually. And now we're going to turn to hear from some folks about how to be more pragmatic and strategic with seeding. And so this panel, we're going to do a couple of introductions, get a little bit of a presentation to ground us in the discussion, and then have an opportunity to ask questions of our presenters. So with that, I'd love for our presenters to introduce themselves. And first, we'll hear from Owen Boffman, who is a colleague of mine at the Nature Conservancy.
Thanks, Anya. Yeah, my name is Owen Boffman. I'm a precision restoration scientist with the Nature Conservancy here in Burns, Oregon.
Thanks, Owen. And Sarah Kulpa, are you on the line with us today? I hope so.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Sorry, I took a second to unmute. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Kulpa. I work for the Reno Fish and Wildlife Office, and I'm their botanist and restoration ecologist.
Nice to have you, Sarah. And last but certainly not least, Roger Sheely. I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. And I'm a 1,000-year-old researcher working on trying to figure out how to use ecological information to better manage our annual grasses. Look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
I look forward to plumbing your 1,000 years of experience in this ecosystem. We've got many pressing questions of what it looked like about 400, 500 years ago.
Sweet. Fun.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over. Owen's going to take us through a little bit of a presentation, which will hopefully set the stage for a really productive discussion among the panelists and everybody here in the meeting today, up to 233, which is really exciting.
Thanks, Anya. Yeah, I will jump right into it. Is everybody seeing my full screen?
We are seeing your presenter mode, so we can see your notes. But if you minimize that, sometimes that, oh yeah, you got it.
Good to go.
No, we're still seeing that screen, the same screen with
I
notes.
just switched it. Let's try.
Now we're good. Now we're good. There might have just been a slight delay.
There we go. Swap it all around. Waking everybody up with these flashing screens. Hopefully we're good there now. Thank you all again for being here to be part of the conversation. I'm going to give a quick presentation here that introduces why we're concerned with promoting perennial plants. And it touches on a lot of the topics that the panelists, Sarah, myself, and Roger are experts on. So we're just going to hit some of these things, and then we'll have time at the end to discuss questions. So pop them in the chat or write them down. I'll start off by just saying native perennial plants are a big deal. They are the foundation of the resilient and resistant ecosystems we've been talking about for the last 2 days. And as we heard yesterday, they're a weapon of choice for resisting invasive annual grasses. And they serve as food, cover, and structure for all the other species out there, from insects to ungulates. And they have survived and adapted to thrive in every type of environment. And what I mean by that is that, 150 years ago, and in many places still today, every piece of the Great Basin or the sagebrush steppe is covered in native plants. And their only job is to figure out how to continue to survive where they're at. And they've been doing that. We've definitely thrown them some curveballs, but they've also supported the livelihoods of countless generations of peoples. The things that we found useful about this landscape all derived from native plants that were there and their productivity. So starting with that, native plants are also becoming a major priority from multiple angles, from everything from the White House to nonprofit organizations. And over the past 20 years, this has really started to take form. This is but a few of the policies guiding restoration that are calling for the informed and increased use of native species. And as Roger said during one of our pre-meetings last week, this is not a fad. This is something this is the future. We're going to need to figure out how to use these better. But as many of you have likely heard or experienced, native plant restoration often fails. That's no secret. I'm not going to dance around that. And it's mostly true in a lot of places. However, we'd like to make the case that it's no indication, this failure is no indication of the maximum potential of native plants, nor is it a a result of some situation in which we've really thrown a book at it and tried absolutely everything. We believe restoration with native plants can and will be more successful and be improved. And there's a lot of pieces that need to be in place to make this happen, but what we want to focus on are a couple, which the panelists here have some experience on, which is the improved use of currently available seed, the increased supply and diversity of seed that we can be made available, and the application of innovative approaches to thinking about restoration planning. I should also note that we're using restoration here in a pretty broad sense, which is, I'm not implying that we're attempting to get back to some pristine natural state, but rather we're trying to get original structure. We're trying to restore structure and function. And in this effort, the more native plants that we can get, the better towards that goal. If you take one thing home today, let it be that native plants have been and still are designing themselves for success in their habitat through a process called local adaptation, in which different groups of populations of the same species are adapting differently to the different habitats that they're found in. And this can be either slow adaptation or it can be actually quite rapid. A recent review of 3,200 populations of native plants belonging to over 100 species found that nearly every trait you measure differs between populations of the same species when you grow them in a common environment. And the great majority of those differences are related to differences in the environment of their origin, and this makes sense. And what I mean by traits are not trivial things like the hairiness of a leaf or the number of petals or something. They're very relevant to restoration. Things like survival, seed output, size, vigor, the timing of plant life stages. These are really important things that can spell the difference between success and failure for restoration. And finally, when planted together in outside gardens, this review found that local populations outperform non-local at least 70% of the time, so more often than not. And these patterns are very similar to others found globally, even though this one focused on things native to the Great Basin only. So this means that there's likely countless pre-made adaptations and native plants out there that we can take advantage of, and this is a really exciting thing. However, we have not done the best job at this to date, taking advantage of this potential, especially for places like the Great Basin or the Sagebrush Steppe. And I've highlighted the Great Basin on these maps with a little dashed line-ish. As you can see here, this was about 15 years ago, and it was the little green dots are the most commonly used sources of the 8 commonly seeded native species that are used in the Great Basin and Sagebrush Steppe. And you can see that these almost all of them originate from outside the area in the Great Basin that we're seeding them that's in most need of restoration with these species. And most are from places that are probably cooler and wetter than the heart of the places we're trying to restore. And with increased fires, invasive plants, and warming climate, we should definitely not be moving plants from hotter and drier places. We should be, if anything, moving them the opposite direction. We should not be moving plants to hotter and drier places. And so I can tell you that in the last 15 years since this, this map's changed a little bit, but not a lot. However, what we do have now that we didn't have then was a well thought out strategy and plan for native seed sources based on science, and as well as the feasibility of managers and seed growers, which are seed zones. Many people have probably heard of seed zones, and I'm just going to do a really quick glance at this. And if you want more information, ask questions later, or Google TRM seed zones or go to this link here. But seed zones inform where seeds can be transferred for the best chance of success. And there are a few quick kinds of seed zones that I will introduce quickly, which is the generalized provisional seed zones, which you can see on the left here, and the empirical, and they both just look like a big splat of colors. But generalized seed zones are not species specific, and they can be used for any species reasonably well. But empirical seed zones are built in a similar way, but they're infused with genetic performance variation data from common gardens for a specific species. And so empirical seed zones are being developed for many of the species we use in restoration. And seed zones also serve as a way to reconcile these two challenges that are butting up against each other, which is, on one hand, local is best, which I just showed you with the local adaptation. That implies that we should only seed the most local thing always. But on the other hand, we have this challenge of seed growers can't grow hundreds of varieties of every species to be local in every place. And so seed zones are a happy medium, and it's the best happy medium we have. But seed zones won't be of any use if we can't find and grow the seeds we need to follow them. So in come the native seed collaboratives to help pragmatically increase the supply of native seed. And fortunately, there are already native seed collaborations popping up like weeds, pardon the pun, in the West. And here's a snapshot of just a few of them from Utah to Nevada to Colorado and here in Oregon. Both Sarah Kulpa and Roger Sheely on this panel are both involved in some seed collaboratives in Nevada or in Oregon. And these are really important groups to help us overcome some of the challenges we have to using seeds better. Seed collaboratives functioning well will also help overcome other challenges to using native seed, like the current limited or expensive availability of seed, or confusing seed sources and all these conflicting seed zones and everything, as well as the volatility of the seed markets. And ultimately, all this will help us lead to better restoration success in the difficult job of restoration. And I want to say difficult again, because we all know that restoration is difficult, even if we have the right things in the right places. And I'd like to talk now about another angle and way to address the difficulty in restoration using a strategic framework that the Nature Conservancy and the Agricultural Research Service have been developing called precision restoration. So restoration fails for a lot of reasons when you're thinking about the journey that a seed takes from the time it hits the soil to trying to become an adult plant. Borrowing from precision agriculture, which is a concept used in agriculture that applies resources only where needed, we call our approach precision restoration, and we've developed a framework that helps us apply a lot of the same principles. I won't get too deep into this yet, but I'll walk through some quick examples with this, ending on one that's very relevant to invasive annual grasses. And I should mention that this work is coming out very soon in an article. It's in the final stages of review, and a lot of other authors have helped work on this over many years, and glasses of beer and cups of coffee. So the first step in this project or framework is to identify critical barriers to success. And what I mean by that can be described here in a quick straw man example. Say you have a large landscape larger than this, but part of it burned, part of it's full of cheatgrass. There's other barriers out there. Identifying the barriers is an important first step. The invasive annual grass barrier that we see here is the topic of this workshop. So I'm going to focus in on that for the rest of this talk, but there's other barriers out there like unknown weather, as you can see at the top, to really hot and dry south slopes that cause problems for growing seedlings, or maybe the really freeze-thaw heavy north slopes. Or perhaps in the burn you have soil hydrophobicity, where the soil's been charred in a way that it doesn't absorb water. Or maybe down here in the right you have flat clayey soils that develop a crust over top of seeds. Either way, there's a lot of barriers out there. This is not all of them.
We lost Owen for a second, such is the fickle internet, but I think you're back, Owen. We just lost you for about 20 seconds.
Whew. All right. After you've identified your barrier, and we're going to focus in on annual invasive grasses here, you need to understand that barriers variation through time and space. And no need to digest this whole figure here, but higher variation through time from year to year in the barrier is on the left, and higher variation from place to place is on the bottom. And if we're looking at cheatgrass here, you can see the screen bubble. It falls somewhere around here, where it doesn't really vary from year to year and where it is too much. I mean, obviously it's increasing, but it does vary highly from place to place. And so the point here is that each barrier will fall in a different place on this graph, and doing this process of thinking through how it varies is a really important way for you to achieve the third step, which is targeting the barrier and helping your desirable plants avoid the barrier or overcome the barrier. And that's our goal. And so to target barriers, you have to work through a few questions, which are in blue here. And without going through this whole figure, which again is going to be available soon for people to take a look at, the 3 questions are from top to bottom. Do you have a critical barrier at your site? Does it vary in time or space? And can you predict when and where that barrier is going to be? And depending on how you answer those questions, you end up at different actions, which are in green here. And I'm going to do a few examples here quickly. So presume you're a super lucky dog and you have no major barriers at your site. There are sites like this. And perhaps natural recovery will work after a fire or some disturbance, or uniform seeding has been shown to work pretty well. In that case, don't change what you're doing, or the point being a uniform restoration technique may be all you need. No need to make it complex. For a more realistic example, perhaps you have major unpredictable barriers, things like overwinter mortality of young seedlings, or spring drought that can strike in different years or different times. So you have a major barrier and it does vary in time and space, but you can't predict it. So we end up down here. And this doesn't mean that you don't have any options because you can't predict it, but it means that you need to probably combine or repeat techniques to address the range of variability in that barrier. And knowing that you need to target the variability is power itself. And an important realization. So maybe repeating seedings or using diverse and wise seed mixes is a good tool. I'm not claiming to have the answers here, but the point is that this framework helps us narrow down on what problem we need to answer and how we need to do that. And it also identifies where there aren't great answers, which is where research needs to step in and help innovate new ideas. So in the final example, which we're all really familiar with here, is intense annual weeds is your barrier. It does vary in space, but not so much in time. And that means that we can predict it. And there's lots of great tools out there for understanding where cheatgrass is or isn't, including your eyes. But in terms of like a large fire or something, there's maps out there that can help you understand where it was and wasn't. And so now that we've honed in on the need to target restoration technique to a specific area, which is where cheatgrass is, we know that we need to find a tool to do that. And as we've just heard today, pre-emergent herbicides can be a pretty great technique for controlling those weeds. But delayed seeding or pre-seeding before you use those treatments is often the only option if you don't have a lot of things left and you need to reestablish those perennial plants. However, I'm going to now present quickly a few slides on a simultaneous, or on a solution that allows for simultaneous herbicide application, pre-emergent herbicide, and seeding. And this is an example of an innovative new tool that this kind of framework can help you identify that you need. So this is called Herbicide Protection Seed Technologies. Some people may have heard it as Herbicide Protection Seed Pods or pellets, but we're just going to call it seed technologies because the exact formulation is still a little changing. And the concept here is pretty simple. And is borrowed from agriculture again. So you package the seeds, as you can see in the top here, with activated carbon. And in this diagram below, you can see that the area impacted by the herbicide is where the weed seeds are getting killed. But these pellets or herbicide protection technologies allow the native seed to escape, their roots to escape through that top soil layer where the herbicide is, and can really allow them to take advantage of this almost fallowing of the weeds. And what that looks like in terms of how it changes the game is you can see in this in this little figure on the right, you have high annual weed densities coming into the site, which is this orange line. And when you apply pre-emergent herbicide, you knock it down really low, and that's a great thing. But the herbicide effectiveness, which is this blue dash line, is strong at the first, but it takes a while for it to wear off. And with bare seeds for some of these herbicides like Plateau, maybe 1 year out is when you can start seeding with bare seeds if you didn't do it beforehand. And with Rajuvra, it sounds like maybe it's a couple more years out. And during that time, little patches of weeds that you didn't quite hit are building in the wings and ready to come back in. And so ideal seeding time would be here at year 0, right when you spray that herbicide. And that is what we're making possible with this herbicide protection seed technologies. It allows you to seed right there and there when you knock the weeds back the most. And I'm saying we here, as I've jumped on this bandwagon recently. There's been a lot of great work at the ag station here in Burns to develop these technologies. I'm merely a messenger at this point. It's the wrong way. So a quick rundown of where we're at with this technology. Unfortunately, it's I don't have bags of it ready to give away to everybody, and it's not on the market, but these technologies are already used in agriculture, which is great promise. We know they can work, and a lot of field trials done over the last 7 years, 8 years by a number of people show that they do work. They do boost native perennial grass establishment from seed by 3 to 5-fold in the presence of herbicide. But unfortunately, they're still in the prototype stage while we find the best refinement. We don't want to roll out a product that is not scalable or is not ready to be the most effective tool possible. And we're also exploring different formulations, as you can see down at the bottom, with coating the activated carbon on versus pelleting. But we've also been looking into industrial production of pellets, which you can see here in this middle photo, in an industrial pellet mill trying to make the pellets economically viable. So a lesson learned is to think about the scaling up and the need to scale up during the development. If this thing can't be applied to thousands of acres at a time, we've missed the mark. So now I'm asking everybody to zoom out really far out to a summary here, which to do so I've written a haiku, which will either please you or will make you a little uneasy. Either way, you're awake. We've been getting on the right trail with native seeds, but we ain't there yet, is my quick take home. And the panelists here and myself would like to sort of point out this summary information here, which is that the use of native perennial plants in restoration has the potential to improve restoration success. It's increasing in priority, and our current use of native seeds has been less than optimal to date. We've not done it as well as we can, or I would argue even close. We need a larger variety of seed sources and species, and we need a lot more learning and innovations by all of us to help us get there, and I think we can. And that is where I will end now.
Thank you, Owen. That was a fantastic presentation, and we have about 30 minutes to have a discussion amongst ourselves. And there are some great questions coming in the chat. But before, Owen, just to spread out the voices, before I direct some of these to you that are specific to your presentation, I would like to hear from Sarah and Roger. And so Sarah, I just direct a question towards you. I thought Owen made a pretty great case of like, we need to keep continuing down this road of getting better at making native seeds work, as other presenters have pointed out. I'd love to use native seeds, but there are instances where they don't work. And so I just wanted to ask you, would you like to elaborate more on the case for continuing down the path with native seeds? Or you could share any other related thoughts to like elaborating on Owen's presentation.
All right, so that's a very open-ended question, but I will try to tackle it. Native seeds has been something I've been working on for it seems like a long time. I must confess, I am not originally a West Coaster. I accidentally ended up on the West Coast through the Seeds Success program, and I haven't left. And somehow I'm still involved all these years later in Seeds of Success and trying to get more native seeds out on the ground. In Nevada, where I work, we started the Nevada Native Seed Partnership. And so that's a whole group of federal, state, nonprofit, university partners that are coming together and really trying to tackle this question, because it's been a question I often get is like, okay, well, how do we do this? So our group actually took the national seed strategy and developed a step-down version, Nevada-specific step-down version. There's a lot of similarities between the national strategy and the one that we wrote for Nevada in terms of getting more native seed out on the ground. But this one is more West Coast specific, obviously more Great Basin specific, and we are doing things. One example is we've really scaled up seed collection in the Great Basin. So when I started with the Seeds of Success program, it was really for conservation was the main focus of that program. And we were putting some seeds into storage, and some were going to Kew, England to be part of the Millennial Seed Bank project. But since then, the need of collecting and getting these genetics from some of these species and using them towards restoration, that slowly morphed the program. So here in the Great Basin, some of you on this call might be on our Great Basin seed collector calls that we usually run, I think, April through October, of all the folks that are collecting under the Seeds of Success program. And we collect seeds for research that go directly to Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, Idaho, where they start developing common gardens so that we can start developing seed zones for some of our species. We do have a lot of seed zones developed for our native grasses, but they're starting to work on some of our forbs. So we have those going on. We still make conservation collections where it's a smaller proportion of seed that does go into long-term storage. And then we also are doing this thing called restoration or large-scale collections, where it's when we get enough, and it's making a large enough collection of seed so that seed can get cleaned and go directly to a grower for increase. So there's enough seed to start increasing it. And so working with partners, I know BLM has funded a lot of the seed increase off of Seeds of Success collections, but us at Fish and Wildlife, we've funded some of them as well as Forest Service here. So those are just some of the things we're doing. I could keep talking, but I should let Roger answer.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Sarah. Thanks for sharing more about your background too. So Roger, it's going to be similar. This is your time to hold the mic and tell us about you and what you're working on. And also just like, if you want to elaborate further on the great platform that Owen sent us off from before we start kind of more of a Q&A, that's your time to do this as well.
All right, great. Well, I really appreciate the chance to be able to visit with you all. And I'm excited because I have an opportunity for you to take advantage of us. And I'm pretty sure that always, that might end up with something really fun for everybody. But I wanted to make a couple of quick points. First of all, I think it's imperative that we continue to work towards trying to learn how to establish these native plants, because we need to preserve the genetics and the diversity of genetics that are out there in order for us to be able to have the genetic capability of actually adapting as climate change and other things happen, disturbances. Really, it's the inherent adaptability of each of the groups of species that we have that allow us to move into the future. And we really need to work hard to preserve those and reestablish those. And the other point I wanted to make, though, is that we're still in the very early phases of learning how to do this stuff, because we spent so much time positively developing plant materials that are more exotic and not necessarily the native plants, but we've spent a lot of time developing those plant materials to be successful with restoration with. And we really haven't spent a lot of time in research trying to understand how to get these native plants established and going well in a healthy community. And I think I'm pretty optimistic that as we begin to push towards being able to do that, there'll be a lot of positive outcomes and a lot of ways that we'll be able to do this successfully. And I know many of you tried it and have some success and not success here and there. And we just need to be more consistent in how we're doing it. And I think we're headed that way. Appreciated everybody's conversations. What I wanted to visit with you about a little bit today was an exciting thing. I want to give HDP, High Desert Partnership, a lot of kudos for the collaborative work that they've been doing over the last several years, 10, I think, and their discussions with Ben and other people have groups of restorationists together. And amazingly, they actually have been working long enough now to come to some ideas and needs that we need in the sage step ecology. And out of that has grown what I'm working on right now, the High Desert Partnership and the ARS and the BLM and the Forest Service and many other groups have been discussing the need for adequate numbers and diversity of native plants in order to begin to restore some of these systems back to something that will have the capability of evolving into the future. And so we've call it the EcoSource Native Seed and Restoration Program. And EcoSource is named EcoSource because what we're trying to do is develop a way to get native seeds more locally adapted to the sites that you're going to be restoring. And so eco-source means that we're trying to match the ecology of the system that you're restoring with the actual variety or subset or biotype that will have a better chance of growing there. So there are a lot of seed groups who are doing similar types of stuff, but nothing so inherently directed at trying to match the seeds, the ecology of the systems with the seeds that you're using. The exciting thing about the discussions are there are many things going on in rural communities that are very serious problems. One of them is that people are moving out from these rural communities, and the natural resource base has been degrading and people have been moving. Most people can't make a living in these areas, and so the economy is very difficult. Combine that with the idea that most agricultural systems and agroecosystems are having less and less water, and the underground water supply is diminishing. And so even regular irrigated agriculture is becoming at risk, and our basic water quality or our water quantity especially is becoming lower and lower. And then we have our rangelands that are becoming invaded with invasive plants, cheatgrass and Medusa head primarily, but also I expect coming are things like yellow star thistle and diffuse and spotted knapweed. They'll join the cheatgrass if we don't get that managed well. And so if you think about what kind of program might actually help deal with all of those, EcoSource native seed and restoration is really geared towards developing a native seed industry in the Northern Great Basin region. And how we anticipate doing that is also aimed at solving multiple problems. One of them is that we think we can develop many different businesses in natural resources, where the businesses in the past have been using natural resources. And we think the businesses of the future are really improving the natural resources. So there's still lots of jobs out here, except for they're at improving the health and functions of these plant communities. And so we're working with local people to develop collection businesses and cleaning businesses and seed processing businesses and working with the agriculturalist and the farmers and ranchers here to see if we can work with them to take small handfuls of seeds and growing them out into larger groups of seeds that we can use for large scale restoration. And in doing that, then we also think that the irrigated farmers here will have an alternative crop. And if you think about the life cycle of say alfalfa versus the life cycle of most of these native plants, I think they can grow these very valuable crops with about half the amount of water. And the groundwater issue is such an important one that if we can provide our irrigation folks with a more valuable crop that only takes about half the water to grow, and we also then supply desperately needed seeds to our range restoration programs, we're killing multiple birds with one stone. So we think what native EcoSource native seed program is really about is creating jobs and providing the source identified native seeds to the local restorationists across the 4-state region, and then also trying to diminish the use of or lower the use of the diminishing groundwater, which is such a critical issue. So I started this by saying I was going to have an opportunity. We're getting ready to get online and start working with folks like yourselves to both provide seeds and to start businesses and start doing things. And we're about a few weeks away from introducing our website that describes and all of what we're doing here and gives you an opportunity to join and see if you want to participate with us. And what I'd hope you'd do is, even though we're not up and running on the website just yet, if any of this interests you, it'd be really exciting to be able to hear from you and let us know that you're interested in staying in touch with us. And as we develop this program, I think that there's something that's going to be interesting in it and valuable in it to almost everybody in the natural resource business. And basically, we together can move from using the natural resources as the primary way of primary way of making a living to actually improving the natural resources as the primary way of living. And that's really what eco-source native seed and restoration is up to. So I hope you'll tap into Ben or someone and shoot us out an email, and we'll keep you posted and get you started as we start to move into this program. Thank you all very much. I hope something there was useful for you.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Roger. Some folks are asking about your contact info in the chat, so feel free to follow up with people individually if you're comfortable
Okay.
sharing out how folks
Yeah.
can get a hold of you there.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that you shared, equal parts about some of the serious challenges facing Harney County, other rural communities as well, and then this optimistic look towards solutions and a new paradigm. So thank you for that. I think there's going to be some questions coming in the chat, but right now I'm going to throw two at Owen. One was further up in the chat. Somebody asks, what do you consider local? We've heard this local seed, like what is the range? And it probably depends, but can you speak to that a little bit, clear that up for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, it will depend on the species. And I think there's so much going on in native plant populations and how they're adapting that it's not easy to see. You can't just go out there and see what's the localest thing. But I would just like to reiterate that regardless of what is the most local or what the most ideal thing to possibly seed at that site is, you have to ground yourself in what's available. And the seed zone approach really is a good way to meet in the middle, because it's answering the question of what is local. It's doing it a little bit coarser than some really, really strict focused approaches that you might be able to apply in smaller landscapes. But it's answering that question, and it's doing it in a way that growers can attach meanings to the different seed zones. And it's a good middle point. So I'll skirt the question and say that it does depend, but at the end of the day, we need to look at what solution is most likely to get closest to that answer. And I think seed zones are the best tool we have so far.
Thanks, Owen. I appreciate those thoughts. And yeah, when you're talking about the seed pellets, I looked under my chair to see if there was this great, sweepstakes of, now you have a bag of seed pellets under your chair. But alas, there weren't any. And yet I'm curious, where are we at with scaling up that seed technology and other seed technologies? There's so many unknowns when you're developing something new, but give us your best take on
if you want
what's coming down the line.
If you want a small handful of them, I can send them to you as something you can hold close while we figure it out. But unfortunately, we're not there at the adoptable full-scale situation yet with herbicide protection technologies. And the reasons for that is not because we're still trying to figure out how to get it to work. I mean, it does work. We're trying to improve the way it works, and refine it into a way that it works the best, but is also the most scalable. It can't be some complex whiz-bang thing that you can't put through a drill or buy 100 tons of. It needs to be something scalable, and so that's why it still is not out yet. But the sizes of the trials are increasing every year. We did a BLM, or the ARS did a BLM trial of 1 acre here in Oregon, and Nature Conservancy has done multi-acre trials as well. But it's still just churning through the gears. We just don't want to unleash this tool and get everybody excited about it, only for it to flop a little bit or a lot. And so it's not there yet, but we're really getting close to technology, a formulation of it, and that really is scalable.
So stay tuned, but don't hold your breath is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, if you can hold your breath for a long time, maybe, but a couple years probably before this, we really land on something that we're like, okay, this is the one thing we're going to try to push up the scale as hard as we can. So, I think it'll vary. I think there may be multiple versions of this for however you want to use it. If you have smaller areas where you can do a little more resource intensive approach, there may be a version of this that, is a better choice than if you're doing, 10,000 acres of it. And so that's a likely place this could go to.
Thanks, Owen. Sarah, I was curious. So we had one question in the chat asking for thoughts on a piece of legislation that is not passed yet, is my understanding, but the Botanical Sciences and Native Plant Materials Research, Restoration, and Promotion Act. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on that. And additionally, I'm just curious for you to look into your crystal ball of your knowledge of what's in the works in terms of native seed optimization and distribution, and what's coming down the pipeline for folks to be aware of in this space?
All right, so I know I have seen HR 1572. It passed the House, but I don't think it has gone anywhere else. And I'm pretty sure that was unveiled by a representative from Illinois at the same time that we had the last national native seed meeting in Washington, D.C. And I want to say that was February of 2017. So I think this thing has been slowly gaining, there was some traction, and then we'll see what happens with it. But I do think it has a lot of important things in it. I also know, if you guys are familiar with the National Seed Strategy, there is a national assessment underway right now by the National Academy of Sciences looking at seed need, trying to just get like a handle on like how much seed do we actually need. I think there's a draft report out right now. So I'm pretty sure if you start Googling National Academy of Sciences, which I can try to find before we get off of this and put it in the chat so you guys can look at that report. But I think there is attention on this, and so many species are dependent on plants for their survival. I think it's finally gaining some traction, at least on the federal side of the houses. I mean, between different pollinator acts and the National Seed Strategy, I think these are things that are really forcing these conversations about how can we do better.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. And folks are showing their appreciation in the chat for the work that all three of you are doing. We have 10 minutes and change left in this panel. And so I am curious, I want the final thought, the last message you want to leave people with. And I'm not going to make that timeline quite as compressed as I did for the last panel. So Roger, we'll start with you. What are your final thoughts? What do you want people to walk away from this panel with, from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's very important when you think about this, the work that you're doing and trying to maintain or restore these native ecosystems, you really need to give yourself a lot of credit, because it's very hard and very difficult to do. And it takes a lot of persistence and a lot of hard work, but ultimately it's what we have to do to make sure that our future generations have the natural resource base that we've been lucky enough to have. So I appreciate all of you for dedicating yourselves to making this happen. The other thing that I wanted to sort of stress was that I've been working on research for lots and lots of years, and half of the time I spent with annual grasses. And I have a lot of ideas that you may or may not have heard about that are published and interesting, like island seeding and trying to establish small patches of native plant seeds on the landscape, and then doing things to encourage them to spread once they're established. Things like trying to understand how broadcast seeding can better be done by understanding the safe sites that are available and timing your seedings with the availability of safe sites. I've also done a lot of work on trying to pick and choose the kind of species groups that you would use to make them most resistant to reinvasion. For example, maximizing niche occupation and making sure that the species have complementary traits that fit different spots in the soil and different phenologies, to make sure that most of the resources are used up by species that you like rather than species that you don't like. I really would like for you to know that we've been working hard over the years to develop an understanding of the ecological processes that drive invasion and how we might overcome the negative ones. And we've put together entire decision thought systems on using, we call ecologically based invasive plant management. We've put together them for annual grasses with principles on how to implement the right kinds of strategies based on the given situations that you have in your particular landscape. And so if you are just getting involved in some of this stuff and haven't had access to that stuff, I would love to be able to share some of that information with you. We have re-vegetation guidelines, and it has like a 14-step program on how you make decisions about how you might do everything to revegetate a system. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's called Guidelines for Revegetating, for revegetation in the Great Basin, especially with reference to weeds. You might take a look at that. I think it's a pretty informative decision tool that you can use. So there's a ton of information out there, and I see, as old as I get, I see almost like multiple generations that are coming in, and I'm hoping that it's fun to look at the very new stuff, but some of the stuff that we've been working on over the years, I think will be really useful to you. So thank you all very much. And I really look forward to being able to work with you on my last hurrah is to try to get a system going in this area that helps businesses get created and helps the natural resources. And I'm excited about doing that. So I hope you'll participate with us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, folks are looking to connect with you based on the chat. And if you want to use a pun, seed any of the resources you mentioned, link them in the chat. I bet people would appreciate that too. Owen, I am curious about your final thoughts, and I will, you know, wide open final thoughts are appreciated, but I will also kind of direct one a little bit more specific question to you. So a question popped up in the chat about, you know, could the seed mixes themselves be producing frequent failures? So I'm curious about your thoughts on that specifically, but also just along the themes of, you know, in your experience, are there overlooked reasons why native seeds are not working? You know, is there some nuance there that that we should shed light on in this discussion?
Yeah. Yeah, to answer that first question, you know, I think the seed mixes that we've been using on large scale seedings of native species are themselves failing us. And it's because if you look at the Great Basin, you look at public land seedings, large ones, there's not been a single one that I'm aware of where all natives have been used in a mix, and all of those natives correspond to even a provisional seed zone, the right one for the area being seeded. That's happened at management scales 0 times, and it's because we don't have those seeds. And so native species restoration is failing, and that's real, but it's not because we are doing it the best way and it's still failing. We have a lot of improvements to be made, and we're already a long way towards that. We've got these native seed groups, and we've got lots of people figuring out the best approach. And so to get to some of my key take homes, we must, and I think we can get better at maintaining reestablishing native perennial plants, and they're massively valuable tools to us in getting what we want from this landscape, and doing it in a way that helps the rest of the landscape as well. And again, that sour taste that you may have in your mouth for native species is real, and I won't argue with it, but it's not because they can't help us, it's because we failed to use them correctly. I'm reading off the screen, sorry, I should keep it brief. So we've not yet begun to use native plants in a way that we would expect a lot of success based on what we know about how they're adapting to landscape. And we have all the knowledge to do this now. And so don't think we've tried everything in the book. We're still in the preamble-ish. And myself and other native plant restoration advocates are not asking you to keep throwing out seed and keep hoping. This is not an ask for just more hope and more patience with the current approach. It's an ask to apply our massive ability to solve problems collectively to solve this problem. And I think we can do it if we get our priorities on the same page and get the right things in the right places. So what we've been doing has not worked, and we're learning and making progress on the need to adapt to new approaches and tools. So fortunately, that path is being charted, and we just need to agree to give it all our best shot. And we need to make concessions too a little bit. I mean, I was a hardcore all native all the time, locals best person myself, and I'm moving into the middle in terms of accepting that there may be some places that we need to use non-natives as a massive trauma sort of Band-Aid situation. So I'm coming to the middle, and so I'd ask other people maybe on the other side to also meet me in the middle. So.
Thanks for those thoughts, Owen. I appreciate that you hit on this theme of collaboration, identifying shared priorities, working towards them collectively. We've heard that theme a lot throughout all of yesterday and today. So thanks Thanks for your thoughts. And Sarah, you have 5 minutes to round us out. You have a wealth of experience in this department, and I'm curious to hear your take-home messages or observations from this panel.
All right. Well, I do not have anything cool to read like Owen, so I'm just flying off the cuff. I too am like Owen, and I was in this local native all the time thing, but I too have come and realized there's a time and a place for different things. I just think we need to define what those times and places are for when non-natives are appropriate. I don't want to give up hope on our natives, and Owen hasn't discussed this yet, but we do have this really cool experiment in the ground. We have three trial plots on the Winnemucca BLM district where we're comparing native, commercially available native cultivars that are typically seeded in big fires to locally sourced seed zone match seeds, and seeing how they compare. We do have some preliminary results on some of these sites that give me some hope that larger scale seeding of locally sourced seed zone match seeds may have more success than what we are doing right now. I remember when I started working on all this seed stuff and I tried to explain to my parents what I was doing. And I tried to put it in simple terms. And I was like, yeah, like we wouldn't buy plants from Florida and plant them in Massachusetts. Like they just wouldn't grow. And I was like explaining to my dad that sometimes we put things that are sourced from Canada in Nevada and they don't grow. And he's like, well, duh. Like, so I really think if we start getting things that are sourced and adapted to our dry conditions, we might have better success even in direct seeding of our natives. I also think our native species probably have some dormancy issues too. Like, so there's been a lot of work coming out of Western Australia on how to break dormancy in their native species. And that might be also the issue too. Like some of our species might need some trigger to break that dormancy, and we can't just expect that throwing seeds onto the ground is going to magically make them grow. There's environmental cues we need to better understand of like what the environmental cues are for some of our native species to make them begin germination. So I think there's like a whole lot of research that we can build upon. So taking lessons learned from the past and building upon those into what we try into the future is going to be, I think, some of the best successes that we can have. I mean, just in my 15 years out west, I've seen a lot of land conversion, and it's super disheartening. And it's something that, you know, if we keep going at the rate of conversion that we're going now, I mean, the Great Basin may no longer exist. And that's like a very sad thought to me. And so I'm willing to work, you know, I want to work with so many people and bring in all this collaboration to try to save this landscape and these species that, you know, obviously captured my heart because I have continued living on the West Coast. So that's kind of where I sit with it. I think this management decisions have to include science. I think there has to be more conversations between research and management. I think if we can set up some protocols to allow small scale research on maybe some of these large scale fire rehabilitation projects, I just think there's ways to get more information. We just have to be more strategic and talk more.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Roger and Owen. This was a really rich discussion. And I'm glad that some of the themes that have like popped up in chat, but haven't really gotten addressed, I feel like we really got to bring some of the nuance there to light and discuss it. I know there's always more to talk about, but thank you, three of you, very much for your contributions. And at this point, I'm gonna hand moderating back over to Ben.
Thank you, Anya and Owen, Roger, and Sarah. Stellar job moderating that discussion, Anya. Thank you. Right on time. So before we take a 15-minute break, we will do the drawing for a knife and this 3930 Bayer Rajuvra hat. So 1 second while I do the random number generator here. And it landed on Elaine Stewart. Let's make sure that she is on the call. And yes, she is. So Elaine Stewart, you got a nice buck knife coming your way and a hat. You mind coming off mute real quick and telling us where you're from? I'll send her a message and try to get the address for her to get her that stuff. But thank you guys, and see you back here at 10:45.
So if you were watching Carrie, she wrote up here, putting it all together and plotting a path forward. And we are going to be joined by Megan Cutsworth, who is going to bring this conference home with another wonderful panel. Megan is an OSU research associate and has been working with the Institute for National Resources team since 2010. She's currently a technical coordinator for the SageCon Partnerships, among other several things, and facilitates discussions on how to best incorporate science-based information into a decision-making process. Megan has her PhD from Utah State University. Some of you will remember Megan from yesterday. Megan, it is all yours.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, you're loud and clear.
Okay, great. All right, well, I'm going to be moderating these last couple of panels. I have a tough act to follow with the great moderation that was happening yesterday from Jack and earlier this morning from Anya. And I really hope that these last couple of panels can kind of tie things all together and leave you guys with some really thought-provoking conclusions. So this next panel, we've heard a lot about a lot of different topics: defending the core, stopping the spread, managing fire risk and fuels, improving resiliency, techniques for controlling annuals and promoting perennials, especially native perennials. And so this is going to really try to start to bring those things together. And this next panel is on prioritizing limited resources and sustaining long-term investment. These were two big themes that came up in the interviews that I mentioned yesterday in my talk, that we really, they're two really big topics. We have under an hour to kind of dig into them. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. So this panel, we decided to, because they're such big topics, kind of divided into three stages that we think of when we're working with invasive annual grasses on the ground: the planning stage for treatments, implementation stage, and the maintenance stage after the treatment is done. And we have sort of different speakers plugging in at different sections there. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. If each of you could come up on video if you're able, that'd be great. And then we'll kind of hear from folks one by one. So on the planning stage, we're going to talk about kind of the tools and different approaches for prioritization. The first panelist that I'm going to bring up is Julie Unfried. She's from Pheasants Forever, and she's the coordinator for the Prineville and Vale LITs. LITs are local implementation teams. And I'm also going to share my screen. Get this out of the way. Okay. Then next we have Chris Dunn. He's a research associate in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, and he's going to talk about potential operational delineations, or pods, an approach to prioritization that the Harney Wildfire Collaborative is really exploring. Then when we talk about implementation stage, we're going to hear from Dallas DeFries. She's the sage-grouse coordinator for Baker County Local Implementation Team, also LIT, in Baker. And then in terms of the maintenance stage, that long-term perspective, we're going to talk to Debbie Wood again. She was on the earlier panel. She's the coordinator for the Crooked River Weed Management Area in Prineville, and Brenda Smith, the executive director of the High Desert Partnership based in Burns, and also one of the organizers behind this workshop. So thank you everyone for being here. So I wanted to start out by showing this slide of the local implementation teams, or LITs, in Oregon. So you can see the geographic strategy map that we saw yesterday is in the background. This is, I think, sort of provides that context that we've talked about, this theme of, you know, grow the core, defend the core, grow the core, mitigate impacts in these different zones. I do want to mention that, I should have said this yesterday, this is a brand new product. I think we finished it in October. So it hasn't been sort of adopted yet by the LITs. And so I think there's a really important phase that we need to go through where I will be sort of helping folks working on the ground understand how they might use this product, and they'll be giving me feedback on what is helpful and what isn't, and how we can adapt this product to make it the most useful. So I just wanted to mention the LITs aren't necessarily using this geographic strategy, but I hope that it will be a helpful resource for them. And you can see there's 3 LITs shown here: Prineville LIT up here in the northwest corner, the Baker LIT, the northeast corner, and then the Vail LIT here. Okay, so, and keep questions coming in the chat, and I will try to get to them in this panel. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go to Julie Unfried. And so Julie is the coordinator for Prineville and Vail LIT. And Julie, can you tell us about these 2 local implementation teams in these very different geographies in the state, different contexts, and how you are approaching prioritization across these very big landscapes, those LITs?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the introduction, Megan. Yeah, so Megan, as Megan said, I was asked to sit on this panel to talk about the local implementation teams, which are collaborative groups here in Oregon that are specifically meant to address threats to sage-grouse at the local level. And so, as Megan said, I oversee 2 of those teams. There's 5 total, and I work with the Prineville and Vail teams. And just to let folks know, both of these teams are still in the early phases of development. So I'm mostly going to be talking about what it looks like to actually plan a collaborative conservation effort rather than discussing what implementation looks like. But just to provide a little bit of context, the LITs were initially convened by ODSW in 2005 with the purpose of utilizing local knowledge and input in a collaborative space in order to pool resources and identify opportunities for cross-boundary conservation efforts that specifically address threats to sage-grouse, and then ultimately seek funding for collaborative project implementation. Dedicated coordination capacity for the LITs was essentially non-existent until 2019, at which time I was hired. And each of the teams that I work with are pretty unique in various ways. And in general, the LIT model is not meant to take a one-size-fits-all approach to collaboration, but rather we wanted to look at these groups in unique ways based on the local needs, challenges, interests, and barriers that each group is faced with. And that being said, as I mentioned before, because the 2 teams I work with are pretty different, that's ultimately going to affect how we end up prioritizing the limited resources that each community works with to ensure that these collaboratives are successful over the long term. So I thought I'd just provide a couple of examples that hopefully reflect that and that are pretty relevant to the conversations that we are having throughout this workshop. So to start off in Prineville, as you can see from that map, or maybe you can tell, the area that LIT covers is essentially within Crook and Deschutes counties. And so recreation is a pretty big land use in that area and is starting to encroach on existing sage-grouse habitat. And so that's probably going to be one of the primary issues that we look at with the Prineville team. So I guess just keep that in mind. And then another thing I wanted to note is that when I first started working in this area, the partners who we were hoping to engage in the LIT, I was pleasantly surprised to find that most of them were already really familiar with the LIT. and had already even begun identifying and seeking opportunities to work collaboratively across organizations. And so even though they didn't necessarily have a formalized platform on which to do collaboration, they were already working together. And so it made it really easy to establish a collaborative, a more formalized collaborative platform. And then if you look at the map again, you can see that the Vail LIT area is mostly Mount Here County, and the two major towns in that area are Ontario and Vail. But the difference there is that this is a much more rural landscape. And so a lot of the partners that we're engaging are living and working in rural spaces. But then we also have quite a few partners who have an interest and investment in this area who are actually located outside of the LIT area. So that really does influence the partner dynamics in that area in kind of a different way. And then another thing I wanted to note is that when I first started working with this group, in contrast to the Prineville area, a lot of the partners we hoped to engage were pretty unfamiliar with the LIT. And so all of this is just to say that I've spent a lot of time since starting this position trying to communicate closely with all of those different diverse interest groups that we wanted to engage in this team, mostly to get a sense for what is actually important to the different folks that we want coming to the table to ensure that we can maintain long-term engagement with the LIT. And then I guess another thing I wanted to note is that it seemed really important to me to communicate not only what the LIT is, but also what it is not. And so that is to say that it's a voluntary collaborative opportunity that's meant to engage diverse stakeholders, and it is not any sort of regulatory authority. And then, so that kind of covers, I guess, the social aspect of the two different groups, but I also did want to touch on briefly some of the more ecological considerations. So you can see, you can kind of get a flavor for it by looking at this map, but the landscapes that we're working with in both of these teams are pretty different. And one example, so even though each group might be working to address similar threats, the way in which they're going to do that is probably going to look vastly different based on the ecological state that each landscape is in. And so an example of that is this invasive annual grass threat. And although, as Megan said, we haven't actually utilized the geographic strategy, I think that for each LIT, it will be a really valuable tool that will help each group understand and develop management options that are unique to the area. So in Vail, we'll probably mostly be looking at management that involves minimizing the spread of those already highly invaded landscapes and protecting those small islands of intact shrub, steppe, and perennial grasslands. And then in the Prineville area, we'll likely be looking at continuing to control invasive grasses that are present in those large intact landscapes of shrub steppe, and actually looking at expanding that large healthy landscape beyond its current perimeter. So that's just a few examples, and I could probably talk in much more detail, but I think the main takeaway that I wanted to provide or touch on is that although these collaborative groups were identified at the state level and convened by the ODFW, my perspective is that it's in order to maintain long-term engagement, it is going to be super important to continue to communicate with those folks at the local level to understand exactly what the specific resources are that are available and what the specific interests are among each of those interest groups at the local level to make sure that we're maintaining that long-term investment. So yeah, that's all I have, and feel free to follow up with any questions.
Thanks, Julie. That's great. And you really have a challenge on your hand managing these two LATs with very different different stages of formation, very different geographies, as we can see. So thanks for that overview. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to Chris Dunn, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Chris can give us a presentation on the potential operational delineations, or PODs. And these were mentioned yesterday a couple of times, and so Chris is going to give us a brief overview. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, so we're going to really talk about the PODs process, as it's often referred to, and I tend to prefer the nomenclature, if you will, of structured decision-making for collaborative wildfire risk management. I'm going to dive into a whiteboard video here in a minute that's going to explain this process, I think, in full and in the best fashion that can be done in a 5-minute presentation. But, you know, what I do want to preface that is that while I'm giving this presentation, there are really a slew of researchers that have contributed to this process, as well as many managers and engaged citizens over the last, say, 3 years, where we try to really work through a co-production model where we ingest a lot of local values into a quantitative environment, and then be able to leverage those quantitative analytics for decision-making support. And so this really is within that collaborative framework, how we can move forward together and address some of the wildfire, in particular, wildfire issues that transpire in today's environment. And so we'll go ahead and jump right into this video now. Apologize here for a second because I need sound.
Welcome back to the Ponderosa Pine National Forest, where staff are working together with the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team to create more proactive wildfire risk management plans. One of the challenges of spatial fire planning is identifying control locations where operations can be safer and have a higher likelihood of success. This is especially important because control opportunities often don't align with ownership boundaries. With a plan in mind ahead of time, everyone involved can be clear on the best actions to take, even in a cross-boundary fire. The science team brings several tools to the table for this effort. The basic ingredients of these tools are intuitive and designed to complement local expertise and judgment. Quantitative wildfire risk assessments, suppression difficulty index, and potential control locations that help form potential wildfire operational delineations, also known as PODs. The quantitative risk assessment uses fire modeling and expert analysis to estimate benefits and losses from fire. Suppression Difficulty Index provides an assessment of the potential hazards and opportunities for fire responders by balancing expected fire behavior with access and mobility. The Atlas of Potential Control Locations maps local conditions where fire lines have and have not been effective in the past, and provides a measure of operational opportunities and challenges for suppression. By overlaying suppression difficulty and potential control locations on a map of quantitative wildfire risk, we develop PODs that summarize risks to important values while highlighting opportunities to effectively engage fire. The science team is already deploying these tools in planning applications on National Forest System lands across the western United States, including for real-time decision support on dozens of large fires. Incident management teams use these tools to prioritize responder safety and assess suppression opportunities on fire operations. And forest managers and their neighbors, like here on the Ponderosa, use these tools to integrate fire into landscape planning, prioritize fuel treatments, and create or improve control opportunities to reduce risk to things they value. Can the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team help with assessment and response planning in your area? Contact us to find out how we can help your forest and neighbors plan for the next fire.
So as we noted earlier, we're really trying to adapt this out of the forest environment and into the Great Basin landscape. with the help of Casey O'Connor, the Burns BLM District, and the Harney County Wildfire Collaborative. And we're pretty early in those stages, but clearly one of the fundamental needs is to really address the values that are ingested into the existing quantitative wildfire risk assessment that was developed for Region 6. And that'll be a foundational piece as we move forward, as well as some additional modeling and fire modeling and potential control location modeling that we're doing across the Great Basin to further advance those. But, you know, as some concluding thoughts, you know, part of our solution to the fire challenge that we're in today is really aligning our actions to support fire management. And so we can look towards that long-term risk reduction. This really is about ingesting multiple values from different stakeholders and turning that into a quantitative environment so that we can then leverage those analytics to help us make more informed decisions. It does form the foundation for addressing shared stewardship and co-management. We've done this process across all of Oregon and Washington national forests, with the exception of Willamette, many forests in California, and then all across Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona. So it's really been expanding over the last couple of years into those environments as a foundational tool and pathway towards addressing wildfire risk. We find that it provides these exceptional communication tools about why we're taking actions that we are taking, both pre-planning and during wildfire response. But we always caution that, you know, just because we deliver these analytics and we do work with local stakeholders, it's not intended to be a substitution for local or experiential knowledge that firefighters and managers have, but rather complementary, that all these can be integrated together to help us move forward. And then in the end, these aren't really, we're not making decisions with these tools, we're informing decisions or using these decision tools. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. I know this is a big topic and I asked you to cover it in 5 minutes, and I apologize for that. I love that wrap-up slide, and to sort of echo some of the themes in the workshop, I think, you know, this is combining proactive and reactive, and, you know, really seems like a great tool for doing that prioritization. So I'm wondering if I can call on Chad Boyd for just a couple of minutes. Chad, are you there? Could you come off mute? I know that Chad's been thinking a lot about this prioritization topic, and I'm curious about your perspective on pods, and kind of, it sounds like that you see that as kind of potentially a game changer for how the Harney Wildfire Collaborative and other local groups work and think about the landscape. And then, you know, we talked about the geographic prioritization throughout this workshop as well, and some of your thoughts on that geographic strategy and the more sort of practical ability to do work on the ground. So if you could share your thoughts for just a couple minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, sure, Megan, no problem. Yeah, and thanks to Chris for that great presentation. The Harney County Wildfire Collaborative, just a real quick 30,000 foot here, is working in the Stinking Water Mountains. The basic notion is that we want to prevent large wildfire, and when it does occur, and we know it eventually will, we want to build the most resilient landscape to fire that we can. And PODS is helping us to do that. And, you know, one of the ways, and Chris didn't say this exactly, but one of the things that I think it's going to do for us, I hope it's going to do for us, is create a common language. When you have a complex mixed ownership landscape, you need a common spatial language to use when talking about management within that landscape. And I think PODS does that. And what impresses me, especially given that we're talking about fire, is I think it's a language that can translate between fire operations people and resource management people, as well as the general public. And I don't know of another language out there that does that right now. And I'm hoping that PODS can do that. I think that it can. It's also a palette for thinking about really a collage of values and uses in, again, a very complex mixed ownership landscape. And I can't say that any better than Chris did, so I'll leave it there. So yeah, we're looking forward to using PODS. It's kind of our first cut in attacking the Stinking Water project. And it's what we hope it will become really the framework around which we build out other uses and values. And more broadly, Megan, and we've been having some back and forth on this, thinking about this notion of spatial prioritization and getting things done on the ground. And at the end of the day, I think our effectiveness in combating annual grasses is really defined by two components. And the first is where we work. And the second is what we do when we get there. And the what we do when we get there part really has two components. It's the knowledge of what to do, as well as the management latitude to do it, okay? So these two components, where we work and what we do when we get there, to me are not just co-equal, but they're co-necessary in that success with one enables the importance of the other. And to use a couple of analogies, Stephen Covey's famous win-win or no deal, I think applies to the importance of where we work and what we do when we get there. Another analogy would be a vehicle analogy. Which is more important for making a car go forward, an engine or a transmission? Well, the answer is that they're both. So the effectiveness prize, if you will, is not our ability to spatially prioritize or what we do when we get there. It's the synergy that results from doing both of those things at the same time and place. And what really excites me is the examples that we have, the growing number of examples that we have in Eastern Oregon of that very thing happening. For example, the SageCon invasive strategy with respect to the prioritization end of that can be combined with the SageCon grazing flexibility group. So that's combining how we prioritize with what we do when we get there. And of course, another example that we just talked about would be the Harney County Wildfire Collaborative and this use of pods and other spatial prioritization tools combined with collaborative and adaptive management on the ground once we get there. So those are just a few thoughts, Megan.
Hey guys, sorry about that. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Man, I've been having some audio issues all across the board. Thank you, Chad. I think I heard almost everything you said. Just a brief break there. Yeah, okay, so thanks for that perspective. Thank you for the presentations. And then, yeah, any questions about pods, put them in the chat. And then maybe, Chris, you can respond to some of them in the chat. Maybe we'll have time to get back to them at the end. I'd also love to hear from other folks in the Wildfire Collaborative, Casey, Dustin Johnson, anyone else who's sort of working on the ground with pods and has some perspective to give to our participants. Okay, so we're gonna shift gears a bit from that kind of planning stage where we heard about the LITs that are really in that planning stage, pods as a tool for prioritization, moving kind of into the project implementation stage. So here's where we're going to hear from Dallas DeFries of the Baker LIT. And the Baker local implementation team got a $6 million grant from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board last year. So it runs from, it's a 6-year period, really meant to be a long-term investment from 2019 to 2025. And so you guys are doing some great work in the Baker area to implement projects on the ground. It sounds like largely focused on invasive annual grasses and other weeds. And I'd love to hear from you on sort of how the Baker LIT decided where to focus work. You're not really limited in resources now, which is kind of unusual. So how do you pick where to work on the landscape? What did you do? How did you decide to do that initially? And then has that changed over time as you've gotten into implementation?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Chad, thank you for, you kind of did a perfect segue into what I plan on talking about. So I really appreciate that. And hopefully I can build upon what you said on a more focus and scale on what's happening in Baker County. So the Baker LIT really started, and they were kind of where the Vail and Prineville LIT are in 2016. And so I think it's important to keep that timeline in mind. As they created this document called the Threat Reduction Plan. And that plan is really the basis of all of our decision-making now at this point where we're at in implementation. And I think the easiest way to think about it is, as we're getting to conceptualization stage to project implementation stage, it's kind of like a funnel where you start out with these really big, broad ideas. And as you get closer to actually doing things on the ground, those ideas narrow down to what's actually feasible. A good analogy, I think, to think about this, or an example here is where are we actually doing projects geographically on our landscape? And so when we started out, we're coming through this with the lens of sage grouse. And so obviously it's easy to say, hey, we're going to prioritize work where sage grouse exists. Beyond that, a next level is, okay, where have there been areas identified as priority areas? And the answer to that is yes. So DFW designated a priority area of conservation within Baker County. And so we're going to even focus more into that area. That does not necessarily mean that we are solely working in that area. We also know that there's importance to connectivity corridors and other strongholds throughout Baker County where there are birds. But, there's a ranking system that happens. And then further into that, within that priority area of conservation, where are our strongest leks? And then you really boil it down to what are the landowners in those areas and what's happening there. So if you think of that funnel analogy, at each step, there's a different level of tools that we use. And I think, Chad, you mentioned the pod is a great framework tool. And there's other spatial analysis tools that are really great framework tools in that beginning section. And then you kind of continue narrowing down using the expertise of all of your stakeholders and local knowledge to really pinpoint where you end up doing a project and implementing. So for us, it's really important once we get to that implementation stage. For those of you who don't know, Baker, our sage grouse geography is actually made up of 70% private landowners. And so the majority of our work is with private ranchers, which puts us in a different ballpark than I think the Prineville LAT, which is actually predominantly BLM ground. But so when we get to that, okay, we have this core area or this transitional area where we really want to focus on invasive annual grass work, then we look at what landowners are there. And this is really the important part because we want to invest our money in areas and projects that we know that there's going to be a pretty good possibility of long-term success. And that means that we have a good relationship with the landowner has a good relationship with us, we work with different agencies, and we really kind of come up with this really cohesive project that's dynamic, and we can follow through year after year after year. And another key component of that is having long-term investment. As Megan said, we have a 6-year grant, and this allows us a lot of flexibility to be able to go back and make sure that what we did, our herbicide treatment, was successful, as you saw in Chris's this presentation earlier about how they had to go back and retreat year after year after year. And things like that. And so, that's kind of how we went from this like big idea to kind of how we're actually doing it on the ground now. And I think it's really important to also keep in mind that we're always adaptively changing to what we're doing. We are always communicating with the stakeholders within our LIT and the landowners and what's needed. And another really important aspect of this is being in touch to the latest technology and research that's happening out there to make sure that, we're in a place where we are doing the best for the ground that we can with the money and time that we have.
Great, thank you. That's a great overview. And one quick question before we kind of move on to the next panel in a minute or two. Could you boil down, what do you think are the key ingredients for success that Baker had to get that big $6 million investment so you could really do some good work on the ground? And how can we transfer those elsewhere?
That's the secret sauce, Megan. That's a really good question. I think what we have is a really strong local group that is engaged in what we're doing. And I think, similar to the success in Harney County Fire Collaborative, it's probably really similar. We have folks that are involved that come to the table who, everybody comes to the table with an agenda. But I think that we are all fairly reasonable and we realize, we all need to make concessions to actually get stuff done. And then we've maintained that level of collaboration and communication throughout this whole time. And it's really that happens at a local level. We are all better informed about what's happening here locally, and then we can scale that specifically to our needs. So just good collaboration, communication is all you need.
That is a theme of this workshop. Sounds great. Thank you, Dallas. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I mentioned the three sort of phases that we're talking about: the planning stage, the implementation stage. Now we're kind of moving on to those post-implementation challenges, the long-term maintenance piece. So first, we're going to hear from Debbie Wood of the Crooked River Weed Management Area on kind of how they've approached those large landscape projects. We've seen some of this in the previous discussion, but tailoring this a little bit to how did you secure funding for that, treatment year after year? Has that been successful? Have you been able to do the follow-up that you've needed to do? So, and I believe Debbie has some slides to share. So go ahead and share your screen, Debbie, when you're ready. And thanks for being here again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me again. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Let me pull it up here. Hang on just a minute. Well,
we can see your screen. It's not in the presenter view, but you could probably proceed with.
Okay, I've got two screens here, so okay, sorry. I didn't think that it. Okay, does that work? Can you guys see it?
You're on the presenter view, so if you just duplicate that, and
oh, okay.
I think we'll be ready to get rolling.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so here I'm going to talk about challenges of follow-up and maintenance. So this kind of goes with our project that I talked about earlier, and with our landowners, our private landowners that we worked with. And here's a picture of the map again. So these were private landowners in up in the post-Paulina IZ Supply area that we worked with from 2015 to 19. So long-term maintenance, this is, the challenge was to, this is not a one-shot solution, and to get landowners on board, landowners after the fact, to keep involved with it. Our funds were for 5 years, but the funds that we did get, each year we had to apply for. This was through the State Weed Board, which is OWEB funds. We did get some ODF and W funds, Western SAR grant funds, but the funds, each year we had to reapply for funds, and so we were blessed able to get it for 5 years. As you can see with this, we had quite a bit of landowners doing extra acres treatment. A lot of landowners, once they realized what they had, they were willing to throw in more funds for the project, get more acres done. This was this grant, they were all 50-50 grants, so the landowners actually put up half the funds for this. And so we were with limited funds, looking at, manageable areas with perennials. Grants are very competitive. So when you're talking about long-term maintenance, sometimes that's not always there in the grants. You know, with this, we tagged on to sage grouse and mule deer habitat, which helped us get the grants. With, you know, the monitoring and inventory is not always included in the grants afterwards. So that was something that we relied on landowners to keep up on monitoring and inventory and knowing what's out there, knowing what to look for. One of the challenges also with grant funds is working with, so the state weed board grants, one of the things is Medusa head rye is on the state weed board list, but Bentonata was not until a couple of years ago. So we're able to get funds for Medusa head, but not for Bentonata. And that's kind of a challenge because Bentonata is coming in. And so, like I said, funds don't usually include money for follow-up and maintenance. So our project objectives really was to rely on landowners and help with the cost and everything. And then they, educating the landowners. That was one of the things, you know, what to look for monitoring and keeping inventory. It was inventory, especially looking at long-term maintenance. I think that's, you know, a quick fix, you know, and move on to the next area. You know, it's not always that way with annual grasses. It's a long-term thought. So you need to have a plan, and we worked with landowners for a weed management plan. Also too, working with neighboring landowners. You know, it does no good to treat one side of the fence, but then the other side of the fence is not treated. So really, you know, getting landowners, neighboring landowners involved, you know, whether it's on public land or private lands. And so, you know, it's the idea of, you know, it's long-term maintenance. You know, if you've got little spots here and there, eventually, if you don't do anything, you know, it's going to become a monoculture. So, you know, it's better to do something than to not do anything. So that's kind of a, you know, mindset with landowners, getting them involved. And so part of the grants was to outreach and education, and keeping that ongoing cooperation with landowners, because we definitely want to keep, you know, what we have, the core areas, you know, keep them intact. And you know, nobody wants to see a monoculture happen. So that's what I have.
Thank you, Debbie. All right, continuing on this theme of importance of sustaining that long-term investment, we're going to turn to Brenda Smith here. And I have a couple questions for you, Brenda. First one has to do with, I know you spent many years on the ecologically based invasive plant management, EBIPM. I don't know if you ever called it that. It's a pretty good acronym.
I like that.
And I'm wondering if there's some lessons from that work on this sort of question of prioritizing treatments, post-treatment maintenance, and continuing that investment in the areas that we do invest in. What's your perspective on that?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. And yeah, this is a, you know, the money the money talk, right? Appreciate what Debbie had to say about grants, and I'll weigh in there a little bit too. But first, so full disclosure, I actually am a weed scientist by training, and have moved to the High Desert Partnership in the last several years. And I will just say that it is because of my many years working in weed science, both rangeland and agronomy, that I have recognized that we really have to pay attention to the people side of this issue if we're going to be successful in any type of ecological treatments. And I'll just go out on a limb here and say that probably most of us are sort of in the ecological world, so we don't have to deal with people. And, you know, it's easier, those plants don't talk back at you. So, but anyways, so I've sort of leaned into the people side of it. And I would say, you know, that is, so let's just talk a bit about ecologically based invasive plant management. And this is actually work that includes Roger Sheely's 1,000 years of experience. But essentially it's a framework that provides, you know, it's a way that we can thoughtfully and strategically approach managing invasive plants. So we all kind of need to know what's going on out there. So the assessment piece, you know, sort of what are our options and how can we integrate that? And we've heard that over and over again in these last few days, you know, like it's just not a one thing and be done with it. And so, you know, I can't emphasize that enough. And that's certainly a key component of EBIPM. There's also sort of a general set of ecological principles, right? Ecological principles are not as well known as, you know, the principles of physics or something like that. But you know, we have some things that we can begin to lean on, and that's helpful. Then it's finally a framework to sort of how do we integrate these treatments and how do we do this on a landscape scale, which inevitably is going to include needing to involve a lot of different folks. And then finally, you know, adaptive management. And I would just say, since I have been involved with rangeland weed management, I think we've gotten a whole lot better around how to implement adaptive management. I feel like when I first came in to this work that we just gave it lip service, and I would say that we're all doing a lot better job around that. So is that?
Well, that is good to hear, because yeah, that's always the paragraph at the end of the plan that
right.
Then you have to do something about it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'd like to call on you one more time, Brenda, and get your perspective on communicating the importance, since you work with the people, communicating on the importance of that, you know, in long-term investment, really coming back to these places. You know, we want to spread our resources around, and I think for good reason, right? You know, it's hard to give up on an area, but you know, there's been talk of we need some metrics, not just acres implemented, not, you know, not some of these other things, but how many maybe acres did we avert of conversion with, you know, early detection, rapid response? I'm curious what your thoughts are on sort of communicating about that need for the long-term maintenance and how we can do that more effectively.
Yeah. And communication is a really big deal. I've been really fortunate to actually, since I've been in Harney County for about 12 years now, to work with some really great folks that have helped me figure out how we can communicate the work that we're doing on the ground to different audiences, right? So we have to first realize that we are not all communicating amongst ourselves. So sort of that preaching to the choir piece, right? That we have to create some sort of communication strategies that other folks that don't know sort of our day-to-day lives on sort of landscape scale restoration understand. And so that's been helpful is, like, first of all, sort of recognize your audiences. And so we have, we want to talk amongst ourselves. And so we have to figure out how to do that communication. At High Desert Partnership, we're using a collaborative process to help us do that, and supporting that through sort of intentional communications. We have funders that we need to communicate with, and I'll just say some of the things that Debbie said is that at High Desert Partnership, if you're a funder, you get to get drug into the mix, right? Like, you are a full partner. You don't just get to give us money. You're in it with us. And one of our other collaboratives, the Harney Basin Wetlands Collaborative Group, is just finishing an Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board Focused Investment Partnership, Dallas. And I just want to say that like we've drugged OWEB through the proverbial mud and literal mud, honestly, about that project. So they're really sort of living the experience with and sort of understanding what we're up against in terms of getting projects implemented and actually seeing sort of landscape scale change and restoration. So I think the main thing I want to say about this, Megan, is that we have landscape scale problems. We really need to come together to develop landscape scale funding pods. Funding is very competitive, and it does pit us against each other, and that is really a bad thing. And so if we can, get funders to better understand what we're up against and sort of the complexity of the issues, and that we need lots of different sort of resources coming in to address, how to restore 320,000 acres. That's going to be a key. So I guess I'll just leave it at that for right now.
Thank you. That's great. That was some great insights to my question. And I feel like those are some great final thoughts. I would also like to channel Jack and do the final thoughts for the panel. We do only have about maybe half a minute for each person. So I'm going to call on each of you in the order that you presented and ask you for your final thoughts. So I will start with Julie.
Yeah, I mean, I think my final thoughts kind of go back to what Brenda was just saying. And, to me, it seems really important to really understand what the partners in your local area's needs are, and also what the resources are available at the local level. And then coming together to identify common opportunities that will call attention to larger landscape funding opportunities, which is what we're hoping to do with all of the LITs beyond Baker in the coming years.
Thank you. Great. Chris Dunn, what are your final thoughts?
Well, I'd certainly like to echo all of yours, but just to add some more to that is, we're really talking about this risk management problem broadly in this case, and that really begins with a fundamental assessment, but that assessment can't be the end all, because we have to turn that into something operational. And that's really the challenge, is following that cycle of the risk management process through. So, you develop your assessment, and from there you start to develop actions and then begin to implement those actions. And as long as we have the important stakeholders and locals along that journey, then things seem to flow much easier and better, because we're educating each other, learning from each other, and engaging completely through that process. And I think it leads to greater outcomes.
Thank you. That's great. Dallas, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just like to add on to the last thing that Brenda said, that we need to think about this on a landscape level. And I think thinking locally at a landscape level. And so really to have success, we need to be thoughtful about how we're planning our projects and how they are coordinating with one another so that we can have greater success, more of a synergetic bigger planning process. And I would just like to add, I think two things or something out of this 2-day workshop is there's a lot of knowledge out there and a lot of people willing to participate. And I think the more that we can teach each other and can continue to collaborate and communicate is really going to breed success in the larger group.
Thank you, Dallas. Great. And Debbie, how about final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think Brenda and Dallas said it pretty good. I think for long-term maintenance, it's coming together. Maybe everybody's got these little projects here and there, but we actually, need to talk. Everybody needs to talk about what they're doing. I just don't see a lot of sharing out there, maybe, of what's really happening. And it'd be nice to all come together, maybe if it's, private lands, public lands, looking at a local level, but also on a landscape level, it's just maybe taking one step at a time, because it's not going to solve 1 year solve deal. I think it's looking long term and at what we can do.
Great. So I heard about collaborating, sharing. These are some real great communicating better, some really great lessons learned. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Really appreciate it. And we're right on time, 1 minute over. We'll call it right on time. And we will now shift to the final panel of the workshop. So this final panel, we have about 45 minutes for reflections. So we're going to reintroduce our first 3 panelists and then add one more panelist as well. So if each of you could turn your videos on as I introduce you, that'd be great. So coming back is Matt Cahill, leader of the Sagebrush Seed Program at the Nature Conservancy. Mark Porter, the Integrated Weed Management Specialist at Oregon Department of Agriculture. Jeremy Maestas, the Sagebrush Ecosystem Specialist at NRCS. And Jeff Rose, the District Manager for the Burns District BLM, who we have not heard from yet. So glad you are joining the panel here. So we really want to try to wrap things up and hit on a lot of the themes that we have talked about over this workshop. So Jeff, I'd like to start with you. We were just talking about prioritization. And you are managing a district that I believe is about 4 million acres, very diverse. I'd like to hear from you first on how you approach prioritization and, making those difficult choices about where you really invest over the long term. We know that's important, and where you walk away. Can you share some perspective on that?
So I appreciate you giving me the easy question first to try to answer, and I'll kind of wind my way to it. Hopefully not too long, and you just give me the axe when I get too long-winded. But it's easy to get lost in the scale of the project or the scale of the issue, and just be overwhelmed by the enormity of it. And when I want a reality check, is I think about it is I currently help manage a BLM district that is 300,000 acres larger than the state I grew up in. And I think about that, and I think, wow, that's quite a bit of ground that I help people be responsible for. But then I think over the last 2 days, we've heard a lot of folks that have, and a lot of tools and a lot of ideas of how to chunk things up. And I go back to Dustin Johnson, and he made me smile when he talked initially about working with Lee Edelman. And I spent some time with Lee, and I think from just the biological sense, as you think about the landscapes and you break it into the structure, the function, the processes, and how they vary over space and time. And those are the five factors that Lee Edelman would talk about on how to do that. So we kind of look at it that way and say, okay, where can we be successful? Where can we have an impact? And if it was just on federal land and just federal land issues, that would be a lot easier. But when we talk about a landscape scale, is that it's much larger than that. Even though the district is 4 million acres, just a little bit under 4 million. You know, Harney County is 10,000 square miles. And unfortunately, I didn't do the math to convert, but you can do the conversion to how many acres that is, but it's a whole lot more acres than 3 million. And it's not all together, it's interspersed. So we have partners and we have neighbors. And I think that's one of the main things we do right now is we look for those opportunities where not only we could be successful biologically on the landscape, but also where we can be successful as a partner and as a neighbor on the landscape. And we look for opportunities where folks can cooperate and we can address these issues at the appropriate scale that we have. Unfortunately, that means sometimes is we're less strategic and more opportunistic. And I think to really get a handle on this problem or this issue is that we have to start shifting to be more strategic, but not forget about being opportunistic, because you always want to be successful. And for public land management, is we have short-term goals, long-term goals, and I think it's good to hold the line, protect the core is what we've heard about, and that's where we can be opportunistic, and that's what we look to do. But as we become more strategic, I think that's where we start to build, and that's where we want to be, and that's why we're really putting a lot of time and effort into working with our partners, our neighbors, and then also with the collaboratives that we've got set up. And you've heard a little bit about the Stinking Water projects, a little bit about stuff we're doing on the Pueblos. And I think these are things that we want to move forward and get going on. You know, invasive annuals are an issue on public lands, but they're not a public lands issue. They're an all lands issue. And that's how we need to look at it. And then to bring people in and help facilitate with each other. We all have special talents and special things that we can bring to the table, and looking for those partners and aligning them up. And that's where we need to help, because it's easy on a difficult issue, especially if it's complex, to retreat to what you know. And I think we're heard the last few days is where we can maybe expand what we're doing. So where do I walk away is I hate to give up, and I don't feel like I give up. And I worked with an FMO, fire management officer here for a long time, Dave Toney, and you know, when things were going bad and we had to get help on the fires, Dave would always tell me that I've never lost a fire, I just ran out of time. And I think that's kind of where we're at, is I don't want to lose this, but I also don't want to run out of time. And I think that's where we look at that. So I'm going to kind of deflect about walking away. I'm just going to postpone working there for a little bit until I can get smarter, or I can find smarter people to help me solve that issue. And I think there's a group of folks I'm on this panel with that are the key to some of those things that we're looking to do.
Thanks, that was great. Wise words there. Okay, so kind of to back out to the really big picture, Matt, I have a question for you. We kind of talked about this a bit at the very early panel, but boiling sort of all our collective knowledge experience down, if anyone can do it, it's you. How would you summarize those key sort of core principles for managing invasive grasses? You know, you mentioned keeping soil cover, managing for perennial grass resilience. What else would you add to that list, or how would you summarize kind of some of those key principles you want folks to take away from this workshop? And then I'll open it up to others as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'll make a start at it, and I'll see how many mistakes I can get out there for others to correct. I mean, I think you touched on the big ones. So we're refreshing all the way to yesterday, the start of 2 days worth of talks. And yeah, what is some thoughts that we can take away from? Well, big picture, there's a ton going on. I think everybody is well aware of that. But the other thing I want people to walk away from is we've made enormous amounts of progress in the last couple of years. And so the job in front of all of us is keeping track of that progress and applying it to our jobs, the lands we manage, and kind of what's within our sphere of control. And I think if that was put into a couple of bullet points, it would be know your neighborhood. We have a lot of tools now that are available for people to estimate what the condition of lands they manage, live, or work on are. We have ways of categorizing those products into pretty digestible concepts of, is this landscape in great condition? Is it in poor condition? Is it on the edge, with the risk of moving in a way you don't want? So know your neighborhood, learn and gain access to these tools or professionals who know these tools, so that you can have an idea of both the footprint you're directly on and that surrounds you, right? Because there is some meaningful scale, and it's nebulous how big or small it is, but it's probably bigger than most of the land that any one of us works on, but it's smaller than everything. That is that footprint that probably matters to define what your options are and what your best bets are. So know your neighborhood. And then the second one is, focus on what's achievable, focus on what's possible. I think, what Jeff is saying, we can't get everything everywhere. But as we heard from previous speakers, I'll point out with what Owen was really driving home earlier in our day, there's probably a lot more that's possible that we have feared was impossible because of, poor success in early days. We're still getting the hang of this. I often, it's a cliche thing, like ecology, it's not rocket science, it's a lot harder. I'm a big fan of that sentiment. I mean, life is complex. There are so many factors out there that interact with each other year to year, decade to decade. Ecology is a much more difficult beast to wrangle than just simply shooting a little metal tube up into space. And so we are getting better at this. We are learning how to do actions that make a difference, but it's going to take more time. So when you're knowing your neighborhood, you got to focus on what's possible. If you're in great condition places, you got to protect that great condition. If you're in poor condition places, you're trying to avoid, bigger problems, more frequent wildfires, new and worse weed infestations. And so then my third bullet point, and then I'll take a pause to let others chime in. Know your neighborhood, focus on what's possible, and then pick the right tool. There's a lot of tools out there. They have different places. Big point that I want to put forward and the Nature Conservancy tries to occupy is pick the right tool in the toolbox. Crested wheatgrass, it has a place. Native cultivars, they have a place. Herbicide use, they have a place. But as we've heard from so many of our speakers over the last couple of days, context matters, what's possible matters, and choosing the right tool in the toolbox is what's hopefully gonna give you more lives more years in your life, because you'll have less frustration of watching, wishful thinking come up short. And hopefully we'll see little by little us turning around the map, turning around the condition of invasive annual grasses across Oregon, which would be, I guess, my last bit. I'll chime in my last 4 point is everybody here matters. Jeremy and NRCS is putting out really great prioritization ideas that have been embraced by Wyoming and Idaho. It's coming to Oregon. We hope it spreads across all of our Western states. Megan, you've been putting, the finer points of Oregon's strategy together under that umbrella. I don't want that prioritization message to make some people feel like they've been lost in this dynamic, that they are in a forsaken zone. I mean, we live where we live, we work where we work. That's the landscape we can make a difference on. And if you know your neighborhood, if you focus on what's possible and you choose the right tool in the toolbox, we can make progress pretty much everywhere.
Thanks, Matt. That's great.
Sure.
I just hope nobody on NASA from NASA is on the call that might be a little offended by your
little
comments
tubes,
about rocket
little metal
science,
tubes, no big deal.
So Mark, I think I'll turn to you next on perspectives on this question. And I remember you phrased it in one of our correspondences as vigilance, diligence, and persistence as sort of those key ingredients. Can you expand on that a bit and any other thoughts you have on these sort of key principles on managing invasives? And you are on mute.
Tricky business being having to pay attention to technology and talk at the same time. So yeah, I love that little threesome, vigilance, persistence, or vigilance, diligence, and persistence, because in my experience of watching people try and manage weeds for 20 years, in my own experience trying to do it, I think those really come down to be the most critical tools we have. And so if I think about them in terms of what we're talking about here today, vigilance, this EDRR scenario we've put out there is huge, and it's going to be a huge effort and take a huge effort. And I think it's going to take a little paranoia on our parts to really be paying attention to where these things are going to turn up, and maybe what some of our older players, rat-tail fescue, or some new players, bristly dog's tail grass, or whatever, are going to do while we're watching Medusa and Vetnata. So it's a big thing. You're not paranoid if there is somebody out to get you, right? And we got to watch for that. That diligence, I think, is really important for us to take into account. I think the monitoring is really what I think about when I come to diligence. We want to do our best, pick our proper tools, but we've got to go back and hold ourselves accountable and give ourselves tools to communicate what we are learning and our successes, particularly to begin to create some momentum so that we can, as an entity and a group, persist in this activity of invasive annual grass management and show, without the red face that maybe we used to have, didn't work, that yes, we are making a difference on the landscape. We are holding the line and making things better in places so that we can get that investment, future investment that we need continued over time to be persistent.
Thank you, appreciate it. Jeremy or Jeff, would either of you like to add anything to sort of that question of sort of these core principles on managing invasives, or are you ready to move on?
I think
Go
Matt
ahead, Jeremy.
and Mark just eloquently summarized it. The one thing I would remind folks I mentioned on the first day, cheatgrass and other invasive annuals are not just expanding because of fire. When we look at the data, probably only a quarter of annual grass transitions are due to fire, recent fire directly. Annuals are spreading all over the place for mechanisms we don't even understand yet. And so I would just impress upon you this idea of managing seed. Managing seed dispersal and production is a principle of managing annual grasses. And so if we instill that in our head, now we're thinking about it every time we go in and do a treatment. It's not a one-year deal. We have to be thinking about what was left on the ground in terms of a seed bank and how long do we need to keep getting it until it's gone. So that would be the other one I'd add.
Thanks.
Go
ahead, Jeff.
I'd like to agree with Jeremy. That was good, and I think both Matt and Mark have really done well. And I also wanted to let Matt know that my dad was not a rocket science, but he was an engineer in the aerospace industry, and as with that, there's a lot of things you as a son of an engineer, you kind of have sometimes a different view on the world, or you're exposed to that. And in the back of my parents' house in the garage was a pegboard that had every tool known to man, right? And behind that tool was a silhouette of what that tool was. So my dad knew what tool I had used that day. And I had a 1966 Mustang, which sounds really cool, but it was a piece of junk. And I had to put it back together constantly. And I chose one tool to do that most of the time. And that was the one my dad would know, is with 10-inch adjustable wrench. Because you could do a lot of different things with that adjustable wrench. And there's three outcomes with that. Either you're going to take the nut off, you're either going to round the corners, or you're going to bust your knuckles, or any combination thereof. And I think what we have to do is what Matt and Jeremy and Mark were talking about, is not one thing is going to fix this. So not one tool is going to answer this question. And also it's not one thing we're going after, and it is a complex issue. And I think keep pitching at them and keep moving at them. The problem is you push in one area and it pushes out another area, and just keep an eye on which it goes. So it's the constant paying attention to what's happening and looking and monitoring is the key to make sure that you can identify that and have an idea. So yeah, I think I think don't get overwhelmed by the magnitude, but also pay attention to what that is.
Thank you. Okay, so next sort of big topic, kind of going back again to the big picture and the organizational structure of this workshop. Jeremy, I'd like to pitch a question to you. Going back to that defend the core, grow the core, mitigate impacts. I'd like to hear your reflections on sort of the panels we've heard in this workshop collectively and where you see those fitting into this geographic strategy. And I will actually bring that geographic strategy up so you can kind of have a visual to go from.
Happy to do it. You know, as the quote spatial guy, you know, who's been pushing these concepts, not special, spatial in terms of maps and geography and the fact that context matters. I'm just fired up by what I'm hearing. I think Julie Unfried on the last panel probably described it best in terms of how she's already thinking about how this informs LIT thought processes in Prineville versus Vail, right? And so I always start in looking at this type of map and I would ask myself, what kind of a neighborhood do I live in? Is it the intact core, the yellow transitioning, or degraded red areas? And if you have options and can choose to work across a large portion of that area, you should be prioritizing those blue places when you can. Currently, it would be really hard to get funding to do early detection, rapid response, keeping annuals out. It's not as sexy. So we always end up in those pink areas and really trying to fight the fire cycle. And we've heard how difficult that is through numerous panels talking about the challenges with restoration. And we have amazing research going on R&D and helping us position ourselves for the future of native rehabilitation of these lands. Currently, that remains really difficult. And so the way I think about this and what I've heard folks start to talk about here is putting on par with our current approach in kind of reacting to where cheatgrass is bad, prioritization of these intact cores. And that includes things like, you know, Debbie described her work in that kind of Paulina area to address those transitioning zones and keep cheatgrass from moving into the more intact parts, those blue areas of that Paulina sage-grouse core area, right? And so managing those roadways, going into places that are still supporting pretty good natives, and using tools like Rajuvra. You know, Harry described releasing the vegetation. And so we have opportunities to potentially release some of that invasive competition pressure, get multiple years of control, which would really reduce the seed bank and seed available for invasive annuals. And that's kind of a key priority in those places. If you happen to live and work in a pink or a yellow area, all is not lost, but you do need to adjust your mindset. And we're hearing that from people as they share their experiences from each of those types of places. And now that you have this context, hopefully that makes a little more sense of why some of those challenges are more difficult in some places than in others. But like Matt has said, you manage what you have. And hopefully now with a bit of more realistic expectations of what's possible in those places. And so, you know, when we talk about fire and fuels management and targeted grazing, those can be controversial topics, but they shouldn't be if you're in that red or that pink zone there. Those should be places where we're all rallying as a partnership to support the mitigation and coping mechanisms that those communities are having to put on the ground to minimize what is a massively large problem. But there are opportunities, as you can see all across that map of blue, where you can defend and help build cores today. That just has to be a decision that you help make. Maybe you have to go knock on doors and build those coalitions of pods or whatever you call them, the partnerships at a local scale that are talking to one another across ownership boundaries. So my long-winded way of saying, I'm so fired up by the 200 plus people that stuck with this. that's what gives me hope on something that's so difficult. And I really appreciate the efforts of SageCon and High Desert Partnership of bringing this whole workshop together.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so I want to do a little lightning round here from each of you in maybe 30 seconds or so. If you could tell us about what you think are one of the most exciting developments in this field of invasive grass management, or a key area where you think we need to really focus that research and investment. And I will start with Mark.
Okay. Yeah, it's, I think I'm going to do both, maybe. Tell you something that I didn't hear addressed yet in this conference that I think is incredibly exciting. It's been exciting in all aspects of my noxious weed control work for 20 some years. And that is classical biocontrol, where we go, and I say we, grabbing onto great people's coattails when I say that, but when weed scientists look around in the native range for these plants to find their natural enemies, they now essentially test them very rigorously for impact and potential to cause problems in a new environment, and then bring them over here and release them in the environment to combat their natural enemy from back home. This is happening actually for cheatgrass and for Medusa head. And it is happening in Europe right now. The Biotechnology and Biocontrol Agency, I think it's in Italy, are working on a mite and a midge and a rust for cheatgrass, and a mite and a gall wasp. And I saw a mention on their website of a fungus for Medusa head rye. They're early on in their work. They are pioneering science, identifying new species as they do this.
Uh-oh, you're freezing up here, Mark. Oh, okay, I think you're back.
A safe and effective, potentially effective means for us to help ourselves in this fight. But I think that's a great opportunity. And I think it's something we need to look at as a group to invest in and think about and entertain as we move forward.
Okay, how about Jeff? Do you remember the question? Some sort of
hit me again.
Yeah. So what do you think is one of the most exciting developments in the field of invasive grass management, or key areas you think we need to focus research and investment?
You know, I think from my standpoint is we could use help on being able to identify where to go, when, and where we're going to be successful, which is obviously the magic question, right? I think in a more operational level, I'm really excited by the native seed push that we're seeing, and the interest in how that's moving. And I think that's the key to help us be a little more successful, is increase availability, increase the availability of different cultivars or regional selection, so we can be successful. I think some of the past experience with native seed was caused by a lot of different things, and I think we need to keep pitching on that and keep moving forward with that. And that would help us, I think, get to the point where we need to be a little quicker. And then just chunking up the landscape is where can we be successful, and help us decide that. And there's been a lot of work going on with that. The other part of that too is we talked about the magnitude of the issue, the magnitude of the information too. You go back to Grant Harris with the early cheatgrass work all the way up to Young and Evans, and you just keep on going. It's cheatgrass in invasive annuals. The research is there's been a long history of it, and it keeps building, and we just need to continue with that to kind of find those pieces that we don't know.
All right, thanks. Jeremy, what about exciting developments, key areas for research or investment?
Well, I think it's actually not one thing. It's the synergy of so many things we've heard the last 2 days. It's technology. It's research and development on plant materials and control techniques for invasive annuals. It's all the stuff that Matt said. A lot of it has just transpired in the last few years. And so I think it's easy to sit here and forget that things are changing. And so I feel like we have much to learn. We have a complex problem ahead of us, but I would throw down a challenge. You know, I told Megan I was going to do this. Sand County Almanac. I don't think I'll do a reading from the book of Leopold, but I'll paraphrase a chapter. 70 years ago, Leopold came to Oregon and he wrote a section called Cheat Takes Over. And in his book, he basically went around the state and said, there's a hopeless attitude here. People have basically given up on cheatgrass. And he really got kind of irritated and said, look, we pay a lot of lip service to conservation at conferences and all these meetings, but on the back 40, we don't even claim to have any tools to fight the problem. I don't think we can say that today with a straight face. We have a lot of different tools, a lot of strategies, a lot of technology. We need to have the courage to try, to monitor, to learn, adapt. And so my hope is that we still are challenged with large scale success stories and demonstration projects. I think was mentioned earlier, sharing those builds confidence, builds learning. And so I would encourage the state to figure out how we can start to do that and build a network of people to improve over time.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. So Matt, back to you. Exciting developments, key areas for focusing research and investment.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take it the way I want to go, and hopefully it's a good enough answer for you. The thing I would say I didn't hear a lot about on this, and that's no criticism, but I, for one, in my job, need to focus on more, and hopefully over the next year, we'll really put more ducks in a row, is making this all pencil out, making this make economic sense for the folks who live in this landscape, recreate in this landscape, be it state, federal, private, especially those folks involved in the ranching industry. You know, Jeff mentioned that the Burns district is larger than the state he grew up in. I did some quick math. I'm guessing that's Connecticut, maybe. And there's 3.5 million people who live in Connecticut. There is several tens of thousands of people who live in Eastern Oregon. So we have a lot of work to do and not a lot of people. And I think we have to remember that, you know, we are also going through an economic crisis right now. We're going through a pandemic right now. We're going through a climate crisis right now. Like, a lot of people are in not a good place. And so how can we make this pencil out for the betterment of people too? And I think there are opportunities for us. You know, with TNC, we are working with our representatives, Representative-elect Bentz, with the senators. We would love to see jobs bills coming through that pay people to do restoration, to do good maintenance to landscapes. I would love to dive in deeper on how we can actually put a price on carbon in these eastern rangelands and help people gain a diversified income portfolio. You know, bunch grasses put almost all of their carbon into the soil. So there is a win-win there where you can utilize forage and recover soil, protect and recover soil carbon. It's complex, it's hard, but I think we can figure it out, and there's diversity in income that can come from that. And then finally, you know, I think we just need to understand the economics of ranching as well as we can and hear from more ranchers. You know, I hope as we go forward, panels and calls like this can include folks from the private sector increasingly. And we can hear about what could change, what could be realistically possible in terms of flexible management, in terms of private side restoration efforts, in terms of diversity and economies of scale within a business, in order to help bring as many people to the table as possible and make sure the few souls that we have in these big landscapes are all empowered and paid to do good work in this shared problem.
Thanks, that's great. Glad you brought that up. So that sort of segues to a question I don't have for any specific person, but if someone wants to tackle it, and maybe you could build off each other. I'm curious if you guys have heard some ways, or think of some ways that we can really think outside the box on these issues. Either something you've heard in the workshop that you feel like is a little bit, different from business as usual, or something else that you'd like to raise, like what Matt just raised that wasn't discussed here. Thinking outside the box. Thoughts on what we need to do there, getting creative with solutions.
Is that just open-ended to all of us, Megan?
Yes. You're off mute, so.
Okay, well, I'll just throw a fun one out there, knowing that we're winding down. It's awesome that there's so many people still on here. I just did my serious soapbox a moment ago. My not so serious, but I'm still kind of serious about it, is I'm really curious about goats. We know that targeted grazing is a tool for fuel strip management, for monoculture mowing. We also know that cattle are not the easiest animals to keep in dense clusters and move around quickly and easily and deal with low amounts of water. So I'm wondering if there is an economy out there where there are dedicated goat herders who are doing targeted grazing exclusively. And that will run into all kinds of complexities of making sure it pays, making sure we don't transmit disease to bighorn sheep populations, yada, yada, yada. But there's just another fun idea that I've not heard much talk about, but I just scratch my head and wonder why we don't have more goats doing some fuels management.
I'm really curious about goats is definitely going to go down as the best quote of the workshop. So thank you for that. Anyone else want to chime in on that before we pitch kind of the final question?
I might. Megan, I think I was really impressed at how many times in this, by different people with different takes, we talked about broad models that we apply at a local level to gather our expertise that comes both directions, up and down. We talked about RFPAs at the beginning for firefighting. We talked about LITs recently and their success and their ability to adapt to their environment. We talked about pods. These things are, I think, really powerful tool. And I would love to invite the group to find ways to take our current infrastructures for invasive annual grass control, those that I've mentioned, but also our cooperative weed management areas, our county weed people, our state weed programs and grantings, and begin to learn some lessons from those 4 models that we've been talking about and bringing to bear to help us move forward in a coordinated way with that actual implementation of management. So I kind of been thinking on those models that we apply locally and that power, and how do we harness that?
Thanks, Mark. And actually my final question, sort of specific question I wanted to pitch to you, Mark, and you kind of started teeing it up there. So I don't know if you have more to add there, but I do want to give you this question before we sort of get to the last takeaway points. You have a ton of experience in this area, and you also were the one who suggested this workshop. That was about a year ago. You're one of my interviewees for the Barriers to Invasive Grass Management, and I'm really glad that you pitched the idea. It was an excellent one. I'm really glad that we were able to make it happen. So, I know you've been working in weed management for a long time in Oregon, and much more broadly than invasive annual grasses, much more broadly than shrub steppe. And so I'm curious sort of your take on building from those kind of the existing structures that we have in place in Oregon and taking those broader lessons learned from other species. Can you provide some words of wisdom for us on kind of how we can build on what has been successful in other areas, other species, and apply it here to invasive annual grasses? I know that's a big question.
Wow. I don't know. Yeah. So I guess I'm so happy to have been able to participate in this workshop, and I have been thinking about this concept for a long time, but you guys took it to a whole nother level of professional insight and community building and things that I think are so hugely important. So I don't know that I can answer it differently except to say that because of my experience with all sorts of weeds in all sorts of places, I was really good to hear several people mention other invasive plants. Roger, star thistle, common carpina, these things are still wicked problems, just like annual grasses and skeleton weed and so on. And they're interconnected. So that helps inform this for me, as well as when I think about, yesterday I was on a call as well or day before to a cooperative weed management area for the Columbia River Basin Cooperative Weed Management Area to deal with an invasive plant called flowering rush in the waters of the Columbia. And there's people from Canada, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, and Washington on the call trying to figure this out. And what that brings home to me is, how can we harness what we're doing here today? Because I think this is such a dynamic group and an important development to spur the development of an all invasive species management system in the state of Oregon and the region. And we have momentum going that way with the Western Governors Association. I think we have an opportunity to demonstrate the power of our partnerships and our pooled resources and our research to actually change our strategy from being reactive to invasive species on the whole, but really to now be proactive, protecting our core of Oregon and the region to address all those invasive species. And so how do we change the conversation in a political and social environment that's just as complex as ecology to kind of work for a bigger picture direction? That's, I guess, what I have.
Thank you, Mark. That's great perspective. So I know, we've gotten a lot of really great insightful comments from all of you. I wanted to offer, rather than going around and calling on each of you to give final thoughts, you've all given some really big, great picture final thoughts for about 45 minutes now. Would anyone else like to reiterate anything, offer a final thought? I will just do this on a first come, first served basis rather than calling on you guys. Anyone want to chime in a final thought?
Megan, I'll start.
I will, Megan. Oh, Jeff beat me to the punch.
No, your picture came up first. I'll
just offer that finally we're getting to the root of the problem in our sagebrush sea. We've been dancing around this, talking about all kinds of threats in the system. There's not anything more scary, perhaps, other than climate change, than invasive annual grasses. And the fact that we're here and we're finally talking about what we're going to do about it in a coordinated fashion is amazing. This is going to be hard, but we're not helpless. We have 100 years of standing on the shoulders of ecological research and science that we can use to our advantage. We got newer, better tools, tactics, strategies, and we're not arguing if it's worth saving the sagebrush sea. We were 20, 30, 50 years ago. Now, here we are, we value it. Let's send in the reinforcements to help our local people be successful. So thank you again. And this has been extremely valuable.
Thanks, Jeff.
Well, it's hard to follow, Jeremy, but I kind of want to give you a tour of Jeff's office here. And in the back there's those are, just to let you know, those are 6 of my favorite perennial bunch grasses and 1 other grass. So the grass on the lower right is cheatgrass. All of those are herbarium mounts that I found here in the district. They all were collected up around Otis Creek around Druzy, Oregon in 1937. And they were picked and mounted and for identification, but I think it reminds me, I keep that in my office to remind me of history and what we've done and the information we've used. And it's not to repeat what we've done in the past, but it's just to learn from it and move forward. And Rick Miller, who I spent a lot of time working with, was a scientist he still is a scientist. He hasn't stopped being a scientist, but he's still a scientist at Oregon State University. And remember one time standing on a hillside looking out over the sagebrush in juniper, and he said, Jeff, is It's right before I became over to the BLM. You said land management is an art and a science. And sometimes the art's a whole lot bigger than the science. And just to remember, keep that in mind, is don't be limited by what we don't know or what we do know. And that's part of the, that's why that creativity question you asked us was hard, because we rely a lot on science. I think sometimes we have to take that step back and allow that creativity to come out and follow that and allow ourselves to make a few mistakes, but eventually we'll get to that point where we can find those successes too.
Thanks. I love that perspective. Okay, we're almost we're almost out of time here. Before I hand it back to Ben to close up the workshop, I would just like to say on behalf of the SageCon Partnership, huge thanks to everyone who participated, but especially huge thanks to High Desert Partnership, who's going to be wrapping things up. They really made this workshop happen. We, we got this idea from Mark about a year ago, as I mentioned, and really thought it was great and wanted to make it work and weren't quite sure how we do that. And I think High Desert Partnership has brought this great local flavor from the Harney Wildfire Collaborative and the work that they're doing locally in Harney County to this workshop, and really grounded it in that and made it such a valuable experience. And sort of like the big problem of invasive annual grasses, the problem of how do you organize a workshop around such a big problem, I think it was such a great grounding in Harney County. And so Ben, Brenda, Brianna, Marla, others at High Desert Partnership, huge thanks to you guys before you wrap it up.
Wow, fantastic, Megan. Great job, Anya. Great job today. I was going to ask if either you or Anya had a final thought as moderators. If you do, please jump in with it.
Just the great group of people we have and the energy and so many participants is pretty mind-boggling. Really great.
Yeah, and I'll share. It's pretty ridiculous to have the final thought of final thoughts of final thoughts. So I'll start with essentially almost a cliche that a saying that many of you are probably familiar with. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's really applicable to this because invasive annual grasses, we feel an urgency around them, especially like a wildfire in your backyard. There's an incredible urgency about that. And yet the scale of the problem over space and over time, that cheatgrass from 1937, we have a long ways to go and we need to go together. And that was a theme that was brought in really, really authentically and strongly into this whole workshop. And yet my one like kind of taken a step beyond cliche is we heard a lot about stakeholder engagement. And I just think we really, we need to bring outside the box thinking to that because often we talk to the same folks and we need to ask ourselves, who have we not engaged in these natural resource decision making, especially when we're talking about public lands that belong to all Americans, not just those that it's their job to engage with a certain decision making process. So that was my one final thought that I wanted to add.
Fantastic. That sounds like who are you inviting next year? Ben, are you out there with your drawing?
I'm out there.
All right.
Yep. So I've already done the random number generator and we landed on, and it had to be a really difficult name to pronounce for me. I hope I don't butcher it, but Soumya Suresh. And she was on just a second ago. Yep, still there. So congrats, Soumya. I hope I got your name right. And I'll send you a private chat to try to get your address to get shipped a Yeti mug. Where are you from?
I'm from California.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your interest in joining and sticking through to the bitter end. You earned a nice Yeti mug and a cool hat.
Nice.
Ben, we're not at the bitter end yet.
Okay.
You need to do one more drawing. While we were going through this and all of the feedback on the work that Carrie did with visuals.com, we arranged to have a framed print of this done as a final giveaway. So Don't have a picture of it yet because we just got it pulled together about 3 minutes ago, but someone's going to get the 2 of these in a frame print, and that frame print is also going to be available to purchase on sparkmercantile.com, which is a local website which highlights makers, creators, and artisans in Harney County and the surrounding area. So you'll be able to purchase this framed from sparkmercantile.com, and we're going to give one away right now. I can see Ben spinning right now.
Molly Jennings, or let's see if that was right. Yeah, Molly Jennings. Let's see if she's still on.
Oh, that was quick.
Cool.
Hi.
Hello, you get an awesome framed print of the graphic drawing.
That's super exciting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Molly, where are you from?
I'm from Ellensburg, Washington.
Okay. Wow. Spreading the prize wealth north and south. Ben, your chance for your last thoughts, and then you can say goodbye.
All right. Well, I'll echo the thank you back to Megan. She put in a ton of legwork on this as well. And the SageCon partners, everybody that agreed to present, and then all of the participants. We had a much better than expected turnout, over 200 participants on both days. Yeah, just thank you to everyone that helped put this off. Really exciting stuff. And you can follow, or you can look forward to a follow-up email with the graphic notes and the recording from the 2 days coming soon. So that's all I have.
Everybody stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.